1970s, a twisted killer was striking at teenage girls on the streets of Manchester.
The police had never seen anything like it before. They said, "We are looking for a monster here."
His methods were brutal.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull.
And bizarre.
The killer had bitten off her nipple and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Those who crossed his path
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on the head.
recall an inner fury.
He stood there brandishing the knife. He said, "The next time I'll put it across your throat."
But what led him to murder?
Individuals like him enjoy being violent. It's gratifying for them. It's who they are.
And was he born in the close-knit communities to the northeast of the city?
It was very much a working class area, although much of the industry had closed down.
It was fairly rough and ready. Terrace properties with backyards, but all the families knew each other.
It certainly was a hard-working community, but there were elements of criminals amongst that community.
Alan Hart covered the local area as a journalist for over 40 years. But in all that time, one story would unfold that was so disturbing, it would remain with him forever. On the 8th of March 1976, Sharon Mossoff was on a night out. It was a rare opportunity for the 17-year-old, who was the eldest of 5 sisters, had spent much of her teenage years helping out at home.
Because Mum was working, Sharon, because she was the eldest, then started to play Mum. And she did a really, really good job of it. She was really, really so much fun.
She was a really great big sister, you know. She definitely took that role seriously, and she took care of us because she had a very nurturing nature.
We completely respected her because she was just like the whole shebang, you know.
Despite attracting attention from the local boys, the aspiring hairdresser had recently become engaged.
She was a real firecracker, you know, and she was very good looking. But, you know, she'd picked her horse, you know.
She was quite young, but she was very mature for her age, so it was a natural progression.
On the night in question, Sharon had been to a works night out in Bolton before returning to Manchester. As she was staying with her father in Failsworth, she was unsure of her route home.
She rang her father at around about midnight. She was told by her father what number bus to get, and he expected her home in about half an hour.
Having caught the night bus, the teenager was last seen at a stop just yards from the Rochdale Canal. Her father's house was just a short walk away. She never did arrive home. There was a big search for her. Her father feared the worst. The following morning, rookie police cadet 16-year-old Mark Wilkinson received a call to head to the Rochdale Canal.
I think it was the first call we had that particular shift to say that there was the body of a female in the canal. I remember the police officer that I was with said undoubtedly it would be a suicide.
But as they approached, the officer soon realised his initial theory was wide of the mark.
When we arrived here at the canal bank, it was quite obvious it was more than a suicide.
The body was identified as that of the missing girl, 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff.
She was naked, half of her body was above the water level, and it was a particularly cold morning. And I remember quite distinctively that the canal, in fact, had frozen over, so it looked as though she was actually leaning on the ice. I remember looking at this girl who was of a similar age to myself and just wondering what had actually happened.
As investigators and press arrived on the scene, the cause of death became apparent.
That's the part where she was pulled out, just down there.
Local journalist Alan Hart recalls the appalling aftermath of a brutal attack.
She had been battered and mutilated, and the evidence seemed to be that she'd been strangled with an item of her own clothing.
Further examination of Sharon's body revealed another sordid detail.
It emerged that one of her nipples had been bitten off.
News of the twisted murder shattered the world of the victim's close-knit family.
The police came and said, "Can the children go upstairs?" But then we heard our mother screaming. We came running back downstairs, and then we just seen our mum go into the ground. And it was just unbelievable. And our mother was sedated for days and weeks. It wasn't a good situation. To see our mother, it was awful.
But the horrific mutilation of Sharon's body was not an isolated incident. Police would soon discover a serial killer was operating in the area. "20 years previously, the canal and network of Victorian streets had been the stomping ground for a group of local kids.
We were on Stanley Street, Newton Heath. I used to live in this area when I was younger.
Colin Hardy recalls growing up in a close-knit community.
All the kids knew each other. All the kids played together. It was a good area, a nice area.
But despite his close group of friends, Colin soon realised he stood out from the crowd.
I think I was probably maybe about 8 or 9 when I realised that my family was different from sort of other families.
Peter Melia grew up in Newton Heath alongside the Hardys.
The family themselves were well respected, really. It was just that Trevor Hardy was the black sheep of the family.
The second youngest of 4 children, Trevor's delinquent behaviour had been evident since his early years.
He started off by doing a bit of shoplifting, stealing fruit from vegetable stalls.
He did have a really bad reputation for breaking into houses, breaking into premises. People didn't leave the doors open. If they went out, they made sure the windows were closed. Like my eldest brother was good at plumbing, Trevor was good at burgling houses.
He broke into my own house, or my parents' house, on at least 2 occasions.
The people he burgled, a lot of the time, was known to the family. It's as if he was punishing us.
Colin believes his older brother's vindictive streak was sparked by a change in the family dynamic.
Just after I was born, he committed his first offence at 8 years old. I think somewhere there was some jealousy that he wasn't the youngest anymore. I also think he harboured a grudge against my mum because she'd brought me into the world.
As Trevor entered his teenage years, his behaviour became increasingly unpredictable.
As he got older, his violence started to appear.
He was one of those people that no sooner a word than a blow.
As a boy, Peter Melia found himself the target of an unprovoked attack.
I came up over the canal bridge and just something in the corner of my eye, some movement made me just turn, and he fired this high-powered air rifle straight at me, hit me in the face, between the eyes just there.
Individuals like Hardy enjoy being violent. It's who they are. It's gratifying for them. It's stimulating for them. And it's not to solve a problem, it's to gratify themselves.
As the wayward teenager terrorised the neighbourhood, his father, a British rail guard, struggled to cope.
I think my dad was scared of Trevor. In all the years I can remember, my dad never argued with him. He never lifted a finger towards him. But I think my dad would have preferred it if Trevor had just disappeared somehow.
As his behaviour deteriorated, numerous escapes from Borstal and approved schools forced authorities to take drastic action.
He was sent to prison at 15. It's a strange way, it's Manchester prison. The youngest person ever to be sent there.
Although nobody knew it yet, Hardy's early misdemeanours would one day pale into insignificance as he evolved into a very different type of... In March 1976, the city of Manchester was shocked by the brutal murder of local girl Sharon Mossoff. The 17-year-old was strangled and horrifically mutilated before being dumped in a canal in the northeastern suburb of Failsworth. As detectives set to work, they would soon learn that the killer's twisted MO had been witnessed before in a community nearby. Eight months earlier, 18-year-old Wanda Scala had just landed a part-time job in a local pub. Journalist Alan Hart discovered a teenager who was very much at the centre of her neighbourhood.
People knew Wanda and they'd seen her growing up as a little girl. The community was quite a tough working class area, but the people were decent, honest citizens by and large.
People did look out for each other. Poverty often leads to that kind of commitment and close-knit attitude.
On the 19th of July 1975, Wanda finished her pub shift in the early hours of the morning. The short walk home along the main road was a well-trodden route for the teenager. But as her brief journey drew to a close, she suffered a brutal attack.
She was about a minute from her home when her life ended.
The local girl's body was discovered by a passerby the following morning. She had been partially covered by rubble on the edge of a building site.
The police had never seen anything like it before.
A post-mortem revealed that Wanda had been strangled with her own clothes. Her death had also been caused by a series of horrific head injuries.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull. And her socks had been tied around her neck.
But investigators were also shocked to find an even more disturbing aspect to the barbaric act.
At some stage during this violent attack, the killer had bitten off her nipple, and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Biting off women's nipples is the clearest example of ritualistic behavior. His aggressive instinct and his sexual instinct become fused so that the aggressive act is stimulating. Nothing could be more dangerous than an individual with that type of dynamic.
Senior officers who thought they had seen it all were absolutely stunned. They'd never seen anything so brutal. I do recall they said, "We are looking for a monster here."
In them days, murders was something you read about in London, Birmingham. I think it caused a certain amount of fear, because, you know, whichever way you look at it, there was a killer on the loose.
Police told women to go out in pairs with boyfriends, brothers, dads. A lot of people were scared. This, after all, wasn't just an ordinary killing. This was the brutal, sadistic murder of a very young woman.
As investigators desperately searched for a lead, neighbouring communities in northeast Manchester continued to live in the shadow of a crime spree. Former delinquent Trevor Hardy had built up his empire over a number of years and had even resorted to recruiting local youngsters off the streets.
He certainly attracted a lot of other young people of my age group in the area. He always seemed to have a few hangers-on.
And I think a lot of them were tea leaves, you know. I think a lot of them were thieves. One policeman did call him Fagin.
For much of the time, the career criminal's personal life had also revolved around the young.
Hardy didn't seem to have any steady girlfriends. He had these friendships with younger children.
During his late 20s, one local teenager had made a particularly strong impression on him.
Beverly was a young girl, about 14, bit of a tomboy. I think Beverly liked the idea of being round Trevor because he had this reputation, and most of the time he always had a few quid on him. And I think with Trevor it boosted his ego, having a young girl.
She said she looked up to him as a father figure. Hardy's version of events became different because he claimed that at some stage they'd been snogging, and Beverly said that this was a figment of his imagination.
As Hardy continued to exert control over the local community, his reputation was increasingly forged through fear.
He was a man to be avoided. He was a man who was totally unpredictable.
He had this reputation as a hard man. And he was. He was handy with his fists. He could walk in a pub and empty it very fast.
Peter Melia grew up in the same neighbourhood as Trevor Hardy. Having had several altercations as a child, he would experience Hardy's violence firsthand on the streets of Newton Heath.
I remember walking along this way, coming from a youth club.
Peter was nearly home when he spotted a suspect character crouched in an adjacent alleyway.
There was a light in the yard behind him. He stood up in the light and I could then see that it was Trevor Hardy. He started to jog down here, so I walked on.
Fearful of Hardy's reputation, Peter headed for the safety of home, but only made it to the front door of a neighbouring pub.
As he approached me, he got about 8 feet away and literally launched himself through the air. He headbutted me in the face and I just felt a really sharp pain in my side. As I got to the corner there was blood in a puddle on the floor near my foot, and I realised at that point that he'd stabbed me. He stood there brandishing the knife. And he said, the next time I'll put it across your throat.
What drives you to stab somebody? There's got to be something very seriously wrong somewhere.
You know, Hardy doesn't think anything's wrong with him. he sees the world in such a distorted way that he thinks something's wrong with everybody else.
Peter Melia was not the only one to bear the scars of Hardy's fury. As his violence intensified, pub brawls would become the norm. He would be imprisoned following a vicious attack in 1972. 3 years later, in October 1975, the neighbouring district of Moston was still reeling from the sadistic killing of 17-year-old Wanda Scala. As police drew up a list of potential suspects, Colin Hardy had received an unwelcome call from his older brother Trevor, summoning him to a local pub.
Well, we hadn't seen each other for months. Well, probably longer than that. A bit apprehensive. I just didn't want to be with him.
Colin had distanced himself from his increasingly unpredictable sibling. Trevor had recently been released from prison when he turned up with his new partner, Sheila.
I think it was probably around about the second pint. It had been idle chit-chat. And just right out of the blue just said to me, "Have you been questioned about the Wanda Scala murder?" So I said, "Well, why should I be questioned about it?" And just as I'm stood here now, he just sat there with no expression on his face and said, "I did it." I did think I'd heard wrong. I said, "You what?" He said, "I did her." My brain just stopped working. I'm thinking, he can't be serious. This Sheila turned around and said, "Colin, it's true." There's not a flicker of emotion in his face. Not a smile, not a frown. My mind just went into overdrive then. If I was scared before, I was petrified now. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from that room. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from him. And I just didn't know how to do it. And people might think, well, why didn't you just stand up and shout, "Somebody get the police"? You go into it's like a meltdown.
Struggling to comprehend his brother's extraordinary revelation, a confused Colin eventually allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him to his flat.
I thought, well, once I get home, you know, everybody thinks you're safe in your own house. But I knew as soon as I walked through the door, I'd made a mistake taking him home.
Colin was about to feel the full wrath of his brother, Trevor Hardy. In July 1975, the mutilated body of teenager Wanda Scala was discovered on a building site in Moston, Manchester. As police searched for the twisted killer, local career criminal Trevor Hardy had just confessed to the brutal killing to his younger brother Colin. Traumatized by the news, he had allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him home.
By the time the brothers got to Colin's flat, Hardy, by now sobering up, began to regret his decision to tell Colin what had happened.
It wasn't even 10 minutes since we went through the door. And I think I said something like, "Well, look, Trevor, you're going to miss the last bus." And that was it then. He went absolutely berserk. Well, I thought I could handle it myself, but I don't even remember the first punch.
Colin's girlfriend could only look on at the sustained and brutal attack that followed.
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on my head. My partner, she was absolutely petrified. I'm on the floor bleeding unconscious. And he turns round to her and says, "I'm feeling a bit hungry, make me beans on toast." And she was that scared, she went in the kitchen, stepped over me and made him beans on toast. And this woman who he was with, this Sheila, she just sat there and never said a word.
Battered and bruised, Colin regained consciousness later that night. The following day, he reported his brother's confession to the murder of teenager Wanda Scala.
Hardy was arrested and police demanded an imprint of his teeth so that they could compare it to the bite marks on Wanda's breast.
But officers were unaware that Hardy had gone to extreme measures to cover his tracks.
He arranged for somebody to smuggle a nail file to him while he was in custody. He'd filed his teeth so that the bite marks on the body of Wanda Scala would not be matched to him.
To file one's teeth down, which is very, very painful, that's quite unusual. This individual really had an awareness of forensic evidence. So he was intelligent. Unfortunately, he used his intelligence in a very, very deviant way.
The case against Hardy received an irrevocable blow when, out of the blue, his partner insisted he was with her on the night of Wanda's murder.
His newly filed teeth, as well as a false alibi from his girlfriend Sheila, meant police had no option but to let him go.
And I couldn't believe it. I said, if you let him go and he effing kills again, I said, be it on your own heads.
Despite his concerns for the local girls in the neighbourhood, Colin was also fearful for his own life.
Well, after that, we turned the flat into a fortress. I put extra bolts on the doors, I put locks, I put wire over the windows, I put broken glass all on the balcony. So basically, we were living in fear.
With his elder brother set on revenge, Colin would suffer another attack. When Trevor only received a suspended sentence, Colin felt the pressure was too much to bear.
I went right off the rails. I got in some trouble and I got jailed.
Although Colin's life had taken a serious downturn, his elder brother Trevor appeared to have turned over a new leaf.
5 months after Wanda's murder, Hardy was branded a local hero in the papers for saving a family from a house fire.
They reported that Hardy, a brave man, had burst into the house and rescued somebody from the fire.
Hardy relished the attention and was pictured beaming in the local papers.
Subsequently, it emerged that Hardy himself had started the fire, not being a hero, but an arsonist.
I don't think he cared as to whether or not people lived or died or the building burned down or whatever. It was just that he could get over on someone. He could manipulate someone. He could fool someone. And he felt good about that.
Trevor Hardy continued to roam the streets of northeast Manchester throughout the early months of 1976. His younger brother Colin was still behind bars when he received some shocking news.
One day, I'd been in the workshops and we'd come back for dinner. And I used to have a paper and right on the front of the Daily Mirror, another girl had been killed. And I knew it was him.
The brutal canal-side murder of 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff bore all the hallmarks of the frenzied attack on Wanda Scala in the nearby district of Moston.
Both Sharon and Wanda had had items of the clothing tied around their necks. They'd both been ferociously beaten, and both had had their nipples bitten off.
There was very little doubt that the person who'd killed Wanda Scala had also killed Sharon Mossoff.
Nobody told us directly, we were children, but we would listen to the grown-ups and we would hear our mother say, you know, apparently he's murdered Wanda Scala. It began to feel very strange to think that this same guy took my sister. So finding that out was really quite strange for me.
As detectives focused their search for a single perpetrator, Colin Hardy could only look on from his cell. Having already failed to bring his brother to justice, Colin felt the latest violent attack was too much to bear.
I've lived with that, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. Always asking, could I have done more?
The police had been up against an elusive adversary, but finally Trevor Hardy was caught in the act. His brutal assault in an Oldham pub on a local woman bore witnesses.
There had been some kind of a dispute between them in the pub, and he'd dragged her into the ladies' toilets, and he'd grabbed her so hard by the throat that she'd bitten her own tongue, and he'd run away when they'd been interrupted.
Hardy evaded capture for a further 2 months, but his final downfall would come at the hand of his now ex-partner, Sheila.
They went to question Sheila at her new flat in Stockport, where she admitted that she'd given a false alibi to the Wanda murder. Police then put Sheila under surveillance, hoping that at some point Hardy would be in touch, and, as predicted, he did go to visit her and was promptly arrested in May 1976.
When they told me they'd arrested him, the emotions was unbelievable. There was guilt, there was joy. I just broke down, tears. I just couldn't believe it. My family was now safe.
Hardy was detained in prison, suspected of the murders of local teenagers Wanda Scala and Sharon Mossoff. However, just 3 months later, the prisoner made an extraordinary revelation to the lead detective on the case.
When the officer was called to the prison, he revealed an absolute bombshell. And that was, in addition to Wanda and Sharon, there was a third girl whom he'd killed.
15-year-old Leslie Stewart had been reported missing in the Manchester suburb of Newton Heath 7 months before the murder of Wanda Scala.
In those days, a 15-year-old girl wouldn't necessarily be treated as anything other than a missing person. More likely a runaway, and certainly nothing as sinister as a murder case.
She'd just joined a long list of sad cases of missing teenagers.
Her disappearance on New Year's Eve 1974 had not been linked to the brutal teenage murders that had later plagued the area. On the night in question, Leslie had been dropped off in Newton Heath and was last seen heading to meet her boyfriend at a party.
And that's the last time she was seen alive.
Unbeknownst to the 15-year-old, Trevor Hardy had been lurking in the shadows.
Leslie Stewart was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another young girl, alone at night, just like the other two.
For her, Trevor Hardy thought he heard the word Beverly.
So in the throat.
After watching Leslie bleed to death, Hardy dragged her to a secluded spot where he dug a shallow grave, then walked to his parents' house where he watched a Hogmanay TV show with his mother.
But Hardy's gruesome account didn't end there. He insisted on taking police to the scene of the horrific murder in Newton Heath.
If memory serves, it's pretty much where the net is, round about there that her body was found.
Although almost 2 years had passed, the 30-year-old gave a detailed account of his attempts to conceal Leslie's body.
He claimed that in the first instance he'd not buried it very deeply, and so after a few days he came back, buried it a little further.
But Hardy hadn't just been intent on covering his tracks. Detectives were about to learn the full extent of the killer's depravity. In 1976, Trevor Hardy was facing charges for the murders of 2 teenage girls in northeast Manchester. But in an extraordinary twist, the local man had also confessed to the earlier killing of missing 15-year-old Leslie Stewart, taking police to the murder site in Newton Heath. Having located a shallow grave, investigators were horrified to discover that the corpse was not complete.
He'd mutilated her body, cutting Leslie's head off. He buried it somewhere else. Then he came back again, cut her feet off and buried the feet somewhere else nearby.
All this was in view of a local school, and he had boasted that the kids had seen him dismembering the parts and playing with them and burying them without knowing what he was up to.
He even took a ring off her finger and gave it to his girlfriend as a love token.
What kind of a person goes back to a body and does what he did?
There was something with that victim that really grabbed him. He was certainly attached to that victim in a way that he wasn't attached to others. He kept going back to relive the experience, to further mutilate the body, and to do other things with the body to continue the gratification.
That is a killer who enjoyed killing.
In April 1977, Trevor Hardy was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murders of Leslie Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff.
Subsequently, he was told life would mean life and that he would have to stay in prison for the rest of his life.
In the wake of Hardy's reign of terror, many struggled to comprehend why he had targeted the young teenagers. Although the profile of his victims bore marked similarities, Hardy maintained that 2 of the attacks were purely random.
I've never believed any of the excuses he's given. Wanda Scala, a mugging that went wrong. I don't believe that for 1 minute. Why mutilate the body? No, he enjoyed it.
These individuals feel very weak inside. They feel very inadequate inside. And so it's not at all uncommon for them to target children, young adolescents, until they gain some degree of comfort in killing, and then they might attack someone who might show some level of resistance.
But was the twisted violence dealt by this sadistic killer the inevitable result of a troubled life? Or was Trevor Hardy born to kill?
Lots and lots of people had similar upbringings to Trevor Hardy, and they didn't go off the rails in the way that he did. He is one of these people who is just pure evil.
My friend who lived on his street said he would kill animals and everything when he was a kid. He was just a very sadistic person.
considering how many murders he did and how much violence was in his life, I definitely think that he was born to just be a killer.
He was supposed to have had some kind of an accident when he was young, and it involved his skull. And there was a splinter of bone, and when he got excited, this bone pressed on the brain.
I don't like to say someone was born to kill, but he certainly had a predisposition for violence. And head injury can weaken someone's inhibitory controls and make it much easier for someone to act out their impulses or what's going on internally.
For many, the horror of this brutal killer has faded away. But some will never forget.
I was just unfortunate enough to have him as a brother, and it'll never go away. You get up day after day and you just get on with your life. I decided to take part in this programme because I wanted my chance to tell my side of things. I have not asked for any payment. I would not insult the victims' families by asking for payment.
And for those who lost their lives, their memory will always remain.
We don't shy away from talking about Sharon because she was our big sister and she was a big part of our life.
She's just remembered as a really, really, really fun, fantastic, nurturing, loving big sister. She's missed every day. She's missed every single day. There's not a day goes by that.
On a February night in 1974, a 17-year-old girl climbed into her boyfriend's car after a high school Valentine's dance, believing the night was almost over. Within minutes, a stranger would rip open the passenger door, attack the young couple, and drag her into the darknet. 46 years would pass before investigators could finally put a name to the man responsible, but when that name emerged, it was not discovered through a confession, a witness suddenly remembering the past, or a weapon found by chance. It came from DNA hidden inside evidence that had survived for decades. The case of Carla Walker began on February 17th, SIL 1974, in Fort Worth, Texas, and for nearly half a century, it would remain one of the city's most haunting unsolved murders. Carla Jan Walker was 17 years old. She was a student at Western Hills High School and a cheerleader. She had spent the evening at a Valentine's dance, surrounded by the ordinary excitement of teenage life. There were friends, music, school memories, and the anticipation of going home afterward. She was with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, a high school football player, and the two were sitting together in his car in the parking lot of Brunswick Ridgely Bowl. Nothing about the moment suggested that Carla was about to disappear. Then the car door opened. A man suddenly appeared. He was armed. The attack happened with shocking speed. McCoy was struck repeatedly with the pistol and rendered unconscious. During the assault, the attacker grabbed Carla and pulled her from the vehicle. MCCOY last clear memory was of Carla being taken away while she screamed for help. The attacker dropped the magazine from his weapon during the struggle. That small object would become one of the earliest clues in a case that would eventually stretch across generations. When McCoy regained consciousness, Carla was gone. The parking lot was no longer simply the place where two teenagers had been sitting after a dance. It had become the starting point of a desperate search. McCoy went to Carla's home and told her parents what had happened. Police were called. Investigators searched the area around the bowling alley. They found Carla's purse. They found the discarded magazine. But they did not find Carla. The young woman who had been taken from the car had vanished into the night. The description McCoy provided gave investigators something to work with. He described the attacker as a white man, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing around 175 pounds. He remembered brown hair cut short in a military-style fashion and a brown cowboy hat. He also believed the man might have been driving a light-colored Camaro. These details were immediately important because the police were no longer searching for an abstract stranger. They had a physical description, a possible vehicle, and perhaps most importantly, the magazine from the weapon used during the kidnapping. But the search remained urgent because Carla was still missing. Hours became a night of uncertainty. The family did not know where she was. They did not know whether she was alive. They did not know who had taken her. The investigation expanded beyond the bowling alley. Detectives began interviewing witnesses and examining people who might have connections to the crime. They also began examining the weapon evidence. The magazine found in the parking lot was associated with a .22 Ruger. That detail would eventually become one of the strangest threads in the entire investigation, because police would discover that local man had purchased a .22 Ruger of the same type. His name was Glenn Samuel McCurley, but in 1974, investigators could not connect him to Carla's disappearance strongly enough to arrest him. McCurley told police that his gun had been stolen from his truck while he was fishing. He agreed to take a polygraph examination and passed it. Without stronger evidence, investigators moved on. The significance of that decision would not become clear until decades later. While police searched for Carla, her family waited for news. But the answer would not come quickly. 3 days after the kidnapping, on February 20th, Carla's body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, approximately 30 minutes south of Fort Worth. The search that had begun with hope ended in horror. Carla had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered. The medical examination revealed the terrible circumstances of her final hour. Investigators determined that she had been alive for roughly 2 days after her abduction. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Toxicology also showed morphine in her system. The investigation had now become a murder case, and the pressure to identify the killer intensified. The scene where Carla was found provided investigators with more evidence, but it also created more questions. Where had she been held during those 2 days? Who had taken her? Why had the attacker chosen her? How had the killer transported her from the bowling alley to the remote location near Benbrook Lake? And most importantly, how had he managed to disappear afterward? In 1974, investigators did not have the forensic tools that would later transform the case. DNA profiling as a criminal identification technology was still years away. Police could determine that biological material was present, but they could not extract the kind of individual genetic profile that modern investigators would eventually use. Yet investigators did preserve evidence. Carla's clothing was kept. Biological material was collected. Her bra would remain inside the evidence system for decades. At the time, the biological evidence could provide only limited information. Years later, that same evidence would become the key to identifying the man who had escaped justice. The original investigation continued through the spring of 1974. Detectives interviewed witnesses. They investigated suspects. They followed leads. McCurley was among those questioned because of his proximity to the area and the connection to the .22 Ruger. But the case did not produce an arrest. Investigators simply did not have enough evidence. The gun was supposedly stolen. McCurley denied involvement. The technology needed to connect biological evidence to a specific person did not exist, and the case slowly began to lose momentum. For Carla's family, however, there was no such thing as an old case. Every day without an answer was another day without justice. Years passed, then decades. Fort Worth changed. People connected to the original investigation grew older. Some died. Carla's parents eventually passed away without knowing who had killed their daughter. Her brother Jim continued carrying the memory of his sister. He was only 12 when Carla was murdered. For him, the case did not belong to history. It belonged to his family. It remained personal. It remained unfinished. And then, nearly half a century after Carla disappeared, the technology changed enough to give the evidence a second chance. Fort Worth police detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett reopened the case and began going through the enormous amount of material accumulated over decades. They worked through old reports, interviewed witnesses and previous suspects, and examined the physical evidence again. What they found was not an empty case. It was a mountain of information. Somewhere inside that mountain was the evidence that could finally answer the question everyone had been asking since 1974. Who killed Carla Walker? The detectives sent her preserved clothing for advanced DNA testing. The earlier testing had failed to produce a complete profile. Modern methods were different. New extraction techniques could recover more genetic information from degraded or extremely limited biological samples. When the investigators tested Carla's bra, they obtained a male DNA profile. This was the moment the cold case began to move. The evidence had finally produced something powerful enough to search, but the first database search produced nothing. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database. No match came back. For a moment, the case appeared to be facing another dead end. They had a full male DNA profile, but no name. The suspect was still unknown. The difference was that investigators now possessed something the detectives of 1974 could never have imagined: a genetic fingerprint capable of being compared against distant relatives. The detectives turned to forensic genetic genealogy. The same broad investigative concept had gained worldwide attention after authorities used genealogy databases to identify the Golden State Killer. In Carla's case, investigators used GEDmatch, a publicly accessible genealogy database, to search for relatives connected to the unknown DNA profile. The search did not instantly produce a killer. It produced family connections. Those connections led investigators toward the McCurley family. 3 brothers with the surname McCurley emerged as possible genetic relatives. One of them was Glenn Samuel McCurley, the same man investigators had questioned in 1974. The case had just crossed a terrifying bridge between past and present. A name that had appeared in the original investigation was now resurfacing because of DNA science. 46 years earlier, McCurley had been interviewed and eliminated after telling police that his .22 Ruger had been stolen. Now investigators had a completely different kind of evidence. They did not arrest him immediately. They needed confirmation. They needed to establish that the genetic genealogy lead was not merely pointing toward the wrong member of a family. Detectives watched. They collected discarded material from a trash receptacle outside McCurley's home. The DNA recovered from that material matched the DNA from Carla's bra. The unknown male contributor had been identified. But investigators still needed a direct sample. When they interviewed McCurley in September 2020, he repeated elements of his original story. He denied knowing Carla. He denied killing anyone. He again discussed the Ruger and claimed that it had been stolen. But the detectives now had evidence that had not existed in 1974. They obtained a cheek swab from McCurley. The laboratory comparison confirmed the match. The DNA found on Carla's clothing belonged to Glenn Samuel McCurley. The case that had remained unsolved for 46 years had finally produced a suspect on September 21st. Sill 2020, McCurley was arrested at his Fort Worth home and charged with capital murder. He was 77 years old. The age difference was staggering. Carla had been 17 when she was killed. The man accused of killing her was now 77. Nearly half a century had disappeared between the crime and the arrest. The detectives who made the breakthrough had not been alive in the same professional world as the investigators who first worked the case. The technology had changed completely, but the evidence had survived. The arrest shocked those who had followed the case for decades, especially because McCurley had been questioned by police shortly after the murder. He had not been a stranger to the original investigation. His name had been in the file. His gun had attracted attention, yet the case had not produced enough evidence to charge him. In 1974, the investigation had stopped short of the truth. In 2020, DNA pushed it across the line, and that was only the beginning of the final chapter. Because after 46 years, investigators now had more than a name. They had a genetic connection, a historical connection to the weapon evidence, and a suspect who had once been interviewed during the original investigation. But a courtroom would demand something more. The prosecution would have to prove what happened to Carla Walker. It would have to explain how the DNA connected McCurley to her. It would have to establish the circumstances of the kidnapping, assault, and murder. And most importantly, it would have to turn evidence that had survived since 1974 into a case that could withstand scrutiny nearly half a century later. The clock had already been running for 46 years. Now, for the first time, it was moving toward a courtroom. The arrest of Glenn Samuel McCurley in September 2020 did something that had seemed almost impossible for decades. It gave the Walker family a name. But a name was not the same as an answer. 46 years had passed since 17-year-old Carla Walker was pulled from a car outside a bowling alley, and during those decades, the evidence had survived while nearly everything around it changed. The investigators who first worked the case had been forced to rely on the tools of 1974. The detectives who reopened it had something entirely different. They had advanced DNA testing, forensic genetic genealogy, modern databases, and the ability to examine old evidence with techniques that could extract information nobody had been able to see before. The result was a chain of evidence that led back to a man whose name had appeared in the original investigation. But before the DNA breakthrough could become a prosecution, investigators had to reconstruct what happened to Carla after the night she disappeared, and that meant returning to the evidence collected during the first frantic days of the investigation. On February 17th, still 1974, Carla had been at a Valentine's dance at Brunswick Ridgely Bowl with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. Afterward, the two sat in MCCO-YS car in the parking lot. The night should have ended with a ride home. Instead, an armed man approached the vehicle. McCoy later described being attacked with a pistol. He was struck repeatedly and lost consciousness. Carla was pulled from the passenger side of the car. The attacker disappeared with her. MCCO-Y's injuries were severe enough to leave him unconscious, but he survived. When he recovered, Carla was gone. Police were immediately confronted with a terrifying question. Where had the 17-year-old been taken? The attacker had left behind one important piece of evidence. During the struggle, the magazine from his .22 caliber weapon had fallen to the ground. Detectives recovered it. That magazine would eventually become one of the most important physical objects in the case. But in 1974, it did not immediately identify a killer. McCoy provided a description of the attack. He remembered a white male around 5 feet 10 inches tall, approximately 175 pounds, with short brown hair and a brown cowboy hat. He also recalled what he believed was a light-colored Camaro. Those details were circulated as investigators tried to identify the man who had taken Carla, but the investigation faced an enormous obstacle. There was no modern DNA database. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no way to take biological material from the crime scene and compare it against millions of people. Detectives had to rely on witness descriptions, physical evidence, interviews, and traditional police work. The search continued into the following day. Then, on February 20th, 3 days after Carla's abduction, investigators found her body in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. The discovery transformed the case from a kidnapping into a homicide investigation. Carla had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Investigators determined that she had remained alive for approximately 2 days after she was taken. Morphine was found in her system. Every detail raised another question. Where had the killer taken her? How had he controlled her? How had he transported her? Why had he chosen Carla? And how had he managed to disappear after leaving her body? The investigators collected physical evidence. Carla's clothing was preserved. Biological material was recovered, but the forensic technology of the period could not produce the kind of individualized genetic profile that modern detectives would later obtain. The evidence was stored, and the case continued. One of the most significant early leads involved a point to 2 Ruger. Detectives learned that Glenn Samuel McCurley had owned a Ruger of the same caliber. McCurley was a local man and was questioned by police. He told investigators that the gun had been stolen from his truck while he was fishing. He took a polygraph examination and passed it. Without additional evidence tying him to Carla, investigators could not make a murder charge stick. The investigation therefore moved on. McCurley remained outside the case. The Walker family remained without an answer, and the years began to accumulate. The passage of time is one of the most brutal elements of a cold case. A week becomes a month becomes a year becomes a decade. Then suddenly the crime is 40 years old. People who were children when the murder occurred become grandparents. The neighborhood changes. Businesses disappear. Roads are rebuilt. Witnesses die. Memories become less reliable, but the victim remains 17 forever. Carla never grows old. Her photograph remains fixed at the age she was when she disappeared. For her family, the calendar continued, but the central question did not. Who killed Carla Walker? The question became part of the Walker family's identity. Carla's brother Jim was only 12 when she was murdered. He grew up carrying the memory of his sister and the absence her death created. Her parents continued hoping that investigators would someday discover the truth, but they eventually died without knowing who had taken their daughter. Their deaths added another painful layer to the case. Justice was not merely delayed, it was being delayed beyond the lifetimes of the people who had loved Carla most, yet the evidence remained. That became important when Fort Worth detectives reopened the case decades later. Detective Leah Wagner and Detective Jeff Bennett began reviewing the massive file. They did not simply read the original reports and accept the conclusions written in 1974. They examined the physical evidence again. They contacted witnesses and previous suspects. They studied the original investigative decision. And most importantly, they asked whether modern forensic science could extract information from evidence that had once been considered inconclusive. The answer came from Carla's clothing. Scientists were able to develop a male DNA profile from biological material associated with her bra. The significance was enormous. The evidence had been collected nearly half a century earlier, yet it now contained a genetic signature capable of identifying the person who had left it. The investigators submitted the profile to CODIS. Nothing came back. That result could have ended the renewed investigation. But it did not. A DNA profile without a database match is still a powerful investigative tool. It tells detectives that the biological material came from a particular individual, even if the individual's name is not stored in the law enforcement system. The investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA belonged to someone already in a criminal database, they asked whether it was genetically related to people whose profiles appeared in genealogy databases. The approach was relatively new to law enforcement, but it had already demonstrated its potential in other major cold cases. Investigators uploaded the unknown profile to GEDmatch. The result was not a direct identification. It was a family map. Genetic relatives began appearing. The investigators followed those relationships backward and forward through genealogical records. Eventually, 3 brothers with the surname McCurley emerged as possible relatives of the unknown contributor. The name was instantly significant. Glenn Samuel McCurley had been part of the original investigation. Decades earlier, detectives had already questioned him about his point to 2 Ruger. Now modern DNA science was pointing toward his family. The coincidence was too important to ignore. But investigators could not simply arrest McCurley based on a genealogy lead. Genetic genealogy is an investigative pathway. It narrows possibilities. It does not replace direct forensic confirmation. Detectives therefore needed a sample from McCurley himself. They conducted surveillance. They watched him. Eventually, they recovered discarded material from a trash receptacle outside his Fort Worth residence. The material contained DNA. Laboratory testing produced the result investigators were hoping for. The DNA from McCurley's discarded material matched the DNA associated with the biological evidence from Carla's bra. The unknown contributor was no longer merely a genetic relative of the suspect. The suspect himself appeared to be the source. Still, investigators sought an additional direct confirmation. When McCurley was interviewed in September 2020, he was confronted with questions about Carla's murder. He again denied knowing her and denied responsibility for her death. He continued to maintain that his Ruger had been stolen in 1974. But this time, investigators had something the detectives from the original investigation had never possessed. They had a DNA profile connected to the crime. A cheek swab was obtained from McCurley. The direct comparison confirmed what the discarded evidence had suggested. The biological material belonged to him. After 46 years, the identity of the man connected to Carla's DNA was established. On September 21st, SIL 2020, McCurley was arrested at his home and charged with capital murder. He was 77 years old. The arrest was an extraordinary moment for the Walker family. It was also a moment of disbelief. The suspect was not a person whose name had appeared out of nowhere. He was someone investigators had looked at during the original investigation. The .22 Ruger had brought his name into the case in 1974, yet the evidence available then had not been enough to prove that he was the man who had taken Carla. For decades, that connection remained buried. Then DNA resurrected it. The arrest also demonstrated how different the world of forensic investigation had become. In 1974, a stolen gun and a polygraph could leave investigators with no path forward. In 2020, a genetic profile could connect biological material to distant relatives and eventually identify an individual. The same case had been examined by 2 generations of detectives using completely different tools. The first investigation had reached a wall. The second had found a door. But the door did not immediately lead to justice. The prosecution now had to prove that McCurley was not simply the man whose DNA had been found on Carla's clothing, but the man responsible for her kidnapping and murder. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence, the investigative methods, and the conclusions drawn from them. The prosecution would have to reconstruct the events of 1974 in front of a modern jury. That meant bringing old evidence back into the courtroom. The magazine from the weapon, the testimony of Rodney McCoy, the DNA from Carla's clothing, the genetic genealogy investigation, the discarded material from McCurley's home, his statements to investigators, and the history of the original investigation. Each piece had to be connected. The case would ultimately depend on whether those pieces formed a coherent chain strong enough to withstand the passage of 46 years. But before the trial could begin, investigators had already achieved something that once seemed impossible. They had turned an unidentified biological trace into a human name. They had found a man who had been questioned in 1974 and connected him to evidence that had survived from that same year. The case was no longer a mystery without a suspect. It was now a prosecution with a living defendant. Yet the most haunting part of the story was still the same. The evidence had been there all along. Carla's clothing had been preserved. The DNA had remained inside it. The information had not disappeared. The world simply had not yet developed the tools needed to read it. For 46 years, the killer's identity remained beyond the reach of investigators. Then science caught up with the evidence, and when it did, the name that emerged was one that had already appeared in the case filed decades earlier. Glenn Samuel McCurley was no longer merely a man once questioned about a stolen gun. He was now the accused killer of Carla Walker. And for the first time since that Valentine's weekend in 1974, the Walker family could look toward a courtroom instead of an empty case file. The courtroom doors opened in Fort Worth in August 2021, and suddenly a case that had been frozen since 1974 was moving faster than anyone could have expected. Glenn Samuel McCurley, now 78 years old, sat before a judge accused of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering 17-year-old Carla Walker nearly half a century earlier. Outside the courthouse, Carla's family and friends carried photographs, memories, and questions that had followed them for most of their adult lives. Inside, prosecutors were preparing to present evidence that had survived longer than some of the people who originally collected it. The trial was not simply about what happened to Carla. It was about whether the evidence gathered across 47 years could finally establish responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. And the first witnesses brought the night of February 16th and 1974 back into the courtroom with painful precision. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend, was no longer the teenager who had watched her being dragged from his car. He was now an adult man carrying memories that had never left him. He testified about the attack and recalled the last words Carla said to him, "Go get my dad." Those words were not merely testimony. They were a fragment of the final moments of a 17-year-old girl whose voice had been silent for almost 5 decades. McCoy described how the attacker struck him with a pistol. The assault left him unable to stop the kidnapping. He remembered Carla being taken away. He remembered the terror and confusion of the moment, and then he had to live with the knowledge that he had survived while she did not. For decades, he had carried that night with him. Now he was being asked to describe it in a courtroom filled with people who had waited nearly 50 years to hear the details. The prosecution then began building the physical case. Detective Leah Wagner had reopened the investigation in 2020. Her work had led to the DNA breakthrough that identified McCurley. In court, she helped explain how modern testing had transformed old evidence. The biological material recovered from Carla's bra had produced a male DNA profile. The profile was developed through modern forensic techniques and later used in genetic genealogy. The process eventually pointed investigators toward the McCurley family. A DNA sample recovered from McCurley's discarded material matched the profile from the crime scene evidence. A direct cheek swab later confirmed the connection. The defense, however, did not simply accept the DNA evidence as unquestionable. Attorneys challenged the scientific process and raised questions about the handling of the old evidence. They questioned whether contamination could have occurred over decades. They examined how many people had handled the evidence. They questioned the laboratories involved in producing the DNA profile. One defense argument focused on whether someone handling evidence in the years after the murder could theoretically have transferred DNA onto Carla's clothing. Wagner acknowledged that numerous people had handled the evidence over the decades, although she testified that the possibility of contamination was unlikely because the evidence had been sealed and stored. The scientific debate became important because the case depended heavily on evidence collected long before modern DNA procedures existed. In 1974, investigators could not have followed every protocol that would later become standard in forensic laboratories. The defense, therefore, attempted to exploit the passage of time. If the evidence had been handled by multiple people, could the DNA have been introduced later? Prosecutors argued that the evidence and the circumstances made such an explanation implausible. The DNA was not simply found somewhere in the police evidence room. It was associated with biological material on Carla's bra, and modern testing had produced a profile that ultimately matched McCurley. The prosecution presented the evidence as part of a chain beginning with the crime itself and ending with the defendant. But then the case took an even more dramatic turn. Investigators had not merely identified McCurley through DNA, they had also interviewed him after his arrest in September 2020. During that interview, he initially denied committing any crime. He denied knowing Carla. He repeated the story that had existed in the case since 1974, maintaining that his Ruger had been stolen from his truck while he was fishing. But the interview continued. Detectives confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to prosecutors, McCurley eventually changed his story and confessed. The recording of that interview became one of the most explosive pieces of evidence in the trial. The transformation in his statements was striking. At first, he maintained innocence. Then he began offering explanations. Eventually, according to the recorded interview presented in court, he acknowledged that he had killed Carla. The prosecution described the confession as the culmination of the investigation. The defense, however, challenged the circumstances surrounding it and raised questions about whether detectives had pressured McCurley into making statements. Those arguments would become important because the confession was not simply an admission appearing in isolation. It came after detectives confronted a 77-year-old suspect with DNA evidence and told him that the science had connected him to Carla. The jury would have to decide what weight to give the statements. The prosecution also presented evidence concerning the weapon. The .22 Ruger had been part of the original investigation because McCurley had owned one of the same type. In 1974, he told police that his weapon had been stolen. Decades later, investigators found a Ruger concealed inside his home. The significance of that discovery was dramatic because the gun had once been described as stolen, yet a firearm of the relevant type remained associated with McCurley. The weapon evidence did not stand alone. It existed alongside the DNA and the statements. That was important because the prosecution's case was cumulative. The state's argument was not that one clue solved everything. It was that multiple independent pieces of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Carla's DNA evidence connected McCurley biologically. The genetic genealogy connected the unknown DNA profile to his family and then to him. The direct DNA comparison confirmed the identification. The historical connection to the .22 Ruger linked him to an important clue from the original investigation. His later statements provided an account of his involvement. and his recorded confession provided the most direct admission. The case had moved far beyond the evidence available in 1974, yet one of the most disturbing aspects remained unchanged. McCurley's name had already appeared during the original investigation. Detectives had questioned him because of the Ruger. He had passed a polygraph. The investigation had moved elsewhere. Nearly half a century later, modern science brought his name back. The difference was that this time investigators had evidence that could not be dismissed so easily. The trial therefore became a confrontation between the old investigation and the new one. The old investigation had produced uncertainty. The new investigation had produced a DNA match. The old investigation had a suspect who denied involvement. The new investigation had a suspect whose recorded interview contained admissions that prosecutors said amounted to a confession. The old case had no identified killer. The new case had a defendant sitting in court, but there was another element that made the proceedings deeply emotional. Carla's family had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. Her brother Jim had been 12 years old when she was killed. Her sister Cindy had lived for decades without knowing exactly what had happened to Carla. Their parents had died without seeing the person responsible for their daughter's murder brought to justice. The courtroom was therefore filled with more than lawyers and evidence. It was filled with time. Every photograph of Carla represented the girl who had been 17 forever. Every witness statement represented a memory from a world that no longer existed. Every piece of evidence represented something preserved from a night that had otherwise disappeared into history. The prosecution's presentation forced the family to hear details they had waited decades to learn, but might also have wished never to. Here, the trial was painful precisely because the answers were finally arriving. A cold case can be easier to live with when it remains abstract. Once the evidence begins reconstructing the murder, the abstract becomes real again. The family had spent decades asking where Carla had been taken and what had happened to her. Now the courtroom was filling in those blanks. The prosecution described the kidnapping. The evidence established that Carla had been alive after she was taken. The DNA connected McCurley to her clothing. The recorded interview provided statements about the killing, and the courtroom was moving toward the question that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974. Would McCurley be convicted? He had pleaded not guilty at the beginning of the proceedings. A jury had been selected. The prosecution had started presenting its evidence. For 2 days, testimony and exhibits filled the courtroom. Then came the moment nobody expected. On the morning of the third day, McCurley changed his plea. He waived his right to continue with a jury trial and pleaded guilty to capital murder. The courtroom reacted immediately. Carla's family members cried and embraced one another. The judge accepted the plea. McCurley was sentenced to life in prison. The trial that had been expected to continue suddenly ended. There would be no lengthy jury deliberation, no verdict after days of argument, no uncertainty about whether the jury believed the evidence. The defendant himself had entered the guilty plea. For the Walker family, the moment was overwhelming. They had waited 47 years for the legal system to reach this point. Now it happened in a matter of minutes. The speed of the ending contrasted sharply with the length of the wait. 4 decades of uncertainty collapsed into one courtroom morning. Carla's sister Cindy Stone later expressed relief, but also the pain of everything that had been lost. Her family had endured what she described as hell while waiting for answers. The guilty plea could not restore Carla. It could not restore the years lost by her parents. It could not erase the memories of the night she was taken, but it did establish legal responsibility. McCurley would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courtroom had finally assigned an ending to a case that had resisted resolution for nearly half a century. Yet the guilty plea also left the public with another question. Why had McCurley waited so long? Why had he maintained his innocence for decades? Why had he finally admitted guilt only after DNA connected him to Carla? And what exactly had happened inside that interview room before he confessed? The answers would become part of the continuing story, because the detectives had not simply found McCurley. They had confronted him with evidence. They had watched his story change. They had heard him describe his involvement, and then they had carried those statements into court. The confession became one of the final links in the chain that ended the cold case. But the case had already demonstrated something even more powerful. The first breakthrough had not come from a confession. It had come from DNA. The confession came after science had already identified the suspect. That distinction mattered. For 46 years, Carla's killer had been protected by silence. The DNA broke that silence before the suspect ever spoke. The evidence found on Carla's clothing became the bridge between 1974 and 2020. Genetic genealogy narrowed the search. Discarded DNA confirmed the lead. A direct sample established the match. Then detectives confronted McCurley, and eventually he admitted responsibility. The chain was complete. A 17-year-old girl had been kidnapped from a bowling alley parking lot in 1974. Her body was discovered 3 days later. Her family waited decades. The case went cold. Technology changed. Detectives reopened the file. DNA revealed a connection. Genetic genealogy revealed a family. Traditional police work identified the suspect. A recorded interview produced admission, and a courtroom finally produced a guilty plea. But even with the case legally resolved, there was one final mystery that continued to cast a shadow over everything. Carla had not been the only young woman murdered or assaulted in the Fort Worth area during those years. Investigators would later examine whether McCurley could have been connected to other unsolved crimes. No additional charges were ultimately filed against him, and those cases remained unresolved. That possibility added another disturbing dimension to the story. If the man responsible for Carla's death had remained free for decades, how many other victims might have crossed his path? The question could not be answered simply because suspicion is not proof. Investigators could not rewrite history based on possibility. Each case required its own evidence, but the question remained, and for the Walker family, the most important fact was already established. Carla's killer had finally been identified. The man whose name had once been just another entry in an old police file had eventually become the person standing before a judge. The evidence that had once seemed powerless had finally spoken, and when it did, it carried Carla's story with it. The Morning Glen Samuel McCurley changed his plea. The courtroom in Fort Worth became the place where 47 years of uncertainty suddenly collapsed into a single word. But before that word was spoken, the prosecution had spent 2 days showing the jury why investigators believed the man sitting before them was responsible for Carla Walker's death. And the most disturbing evidence came not from 1974, but from a police interview recorded after McCurley's arrest in 2020. The video began quietly. McCurley sat in an interview room while detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett confronted him with the evidence that had brought them to his door. For decades, he had been able to live with the unanswered questions surrounding Carla's murder. Now the detectives told him that the evidence had led them to him. They placed a photograph of Carla in front of him. The investigation was no longer about a faceless killer from the past. It was about the man sitting in that room. At first, McCurley denied knowing Carla or having anything to do with her murder. He attempted to explain the events of that night in a way that separated him from the violence. He described seeing Carla and Rodney McCoy in the car. He claimed that he had intervened because he believed the couple were arguing. He attempted to portray himself as someone who had stepped into a conflict rather than someone who had planned a kidnapping. But the detectives already knew the story they were confronting. They had the DNA. They had the historical evidence. They had the original reports. They knew that McCurley had been questioned in 1974 because he owned a Ruger of the type believed to have been used during the abduction. They knew that his name had appeared in the investigation decades earlier and that he had told police the gun had been stolen. Now, after 46 years, the forensic evidence had returned them to the same name. The interview lasted hours. McCurley's account shifted as the detectives continued asking questions. At first, he denied committing a crime. Then he acknowledged being present. He described a confrontation with McCoy, but minimized the violence. He said he had taken Carla away. He initially claimed that their sexual contact had been consensual, a claim that investigators rejected based on the forensic evidence and the circumstances of the case. The detectives continued pressing him. They told him they knew what had happened. They told him the DNA connected him to Carla. Eventually, his resistance began to collapse. According to the recorded interview presented at trial, McCurley admitted that he had killed Carla. He described choking her. He said he had become afraid that she would tell someone what had happened. At one point, when Detective Wagner asked whether he was guilty of raping and killing Carla, McCurley responded, "I guess it was an extraordinary moment because the case had spent decades without a confession." Yet the confession did not arrive in the first hours after the murder. It arrived nearly half a century later, after science had forced the past back into the present. The prosecution played the recording for the jury during the second day of the 2021 trial. Jurors could hear McCurley's voice. They could hear the hesitation. They could hear the changes in his story. They could hear detectives confronting him with evidence that had not existed in usable form when the original investigation began. The defense challenged the admissibility and circumstances of the interview. Attorneys argued that McCurley had been confused and that his medical condition and the detective's questioning should be considered when evaluating his statements. Before the trial, Judge Elizabeth Beach ruled that McCurley had voluntarily waived his rights and agreed to speak with investigators under the totality of the circumstances. The recorded interview was therefore allowed to become evidence. The prosecution had another dramatic piece of evidence waiting. During the interview, McCurley eventually told detectives where a pistol was hidden inside his home. He described the weapon as wrapped in a towel and concealed in the rafters of the attic. Investigators searched the location. They found a .22 Ruger pistol where McCurley had said it would be. The weapon was introduced as evidence in court. That discovery gave the prosecution an extraordinary physical connection to the original investigation. In 1974, detectives had been told that McCurley's Ruger had been stolen. Nearly 50 years later, a .22 Ruger was found hidden inside his home after McCurley himself directed investigators to it. The defense could challenge the significance of the firearm. Finding a gun decades later does not automatically prove that it was the exact weapon used in a murder. But the prosecution did not need the pistol to carry the entire case. It was another piece in a much larger puzzle. The strongest physical evidence remained the DNA. Investigators had reopened the case in 2019, and advanced testing of biological material from Carla's clothing produced a male DNA profile. That profile was submitted to GEDmatch, a genealogy database that investigators could use to identify relatives of an unknown contributor. The search led detectives toward a family of 3 brothers named McCurley. Glenn McCurley became the focus. Investigators then collected discarded material from outside his home. The DNA matched the biological material recovered from Carla's bra. The scientific connection was followed by a direct comparison. The evidence had finally transformed a family connection into an individual identification. The defense attempted to undermine that evidence by questioning how the old biological material had been handled. Decades of storage meant that many people had potentially come into contact with evidence collected in 1974. The defense raised the possibility of contamination and challenged the reliability of testing evidence that had been preserved for so long. But investigators testified that the evidence had been sealed and stored, and the prosecution argued that the DNA profile was not the result of accidental contamination. Instead, it represented the biological material left by the person responsible for the assault. The jury was therefore confronted with 2 very different interpretations of the same evidence. One interpretation required accepting that the DNA was connected to the killer. The other required accepting that contamination or some other explanation could account for the match. But the DNA was not alone. There was the original connection to the Ruger. There was McCurley's presence in the area. There was his later discovery of the hidden pistol. There was the genetic genealogy trail. There was the direct DNA match. There was the recorded interview, and there was the confession. The prosecution had spent decades building a case without knowing that it would eventually be possible to connect all these pieces. Now, inside a courtroom, those pieces were being assembled in front of a jury. The story of Carla's final night was becoming clearer. She had attended the Western Hills High School Valentine's dance with McCoy. Afterward, the 2 sat in his car outside a bowling alley. McCurley approached. McCoy was attacked with a pistol. Carla was taken. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. The medical evidence established that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Morphine was found in her system. She had not died immediately after being taken. She had been alive for roughly 2 days. Those facts made the crime even more difficult for Carla's family to comprehend. The 17-year-old who had left home for a school dance had endured an ordeal that continued long after the moment she was pulled from McCoy's car. The family had spent decades imagining what those final hours might have looked like. Now, in court, the evidence was filling in parts of the story. Yet even the confession could not answer every question. McCurley admitted killing Carla, but he continued to dispute aspects of the prosecution's account. In the recorded interview, he denied beating her in the way prosecutors described and attempted to minimize parts of the assault. That left Carla's siblings frustrated. They wanted the complete truth. They wanted to know exactly what had happened to their sister. They wanted McCurley to stop protecting himself with partial explanation, and they wanted to know whether Carla had been his only victim. The question would become one of the emotional themes surrounding the end of the trial. But the prosecution was focused on one victim and one crime. The legal system could not convict McCurley for crimes that had not been proven. It could only hold him accountable for Carla's murder. That distinction was important. Rumors and suspicions could not substitute for evidence. Investigators and prosecutors had to establish the case that existed in court, and that case was already overwhelming enough to produce a dramatic development. McCurley had begun the trial pleading not guilty. On August 20th, SIL 2021, jury selection had taken place. 12 Tarrant County residents were selected to determine whether the 78-year-old defendant was guilty of capital murder. The trial began. Testimony was presented. The jury heard from McCoy. They heard evidence concerning the DNA. They watched the interrogation video. They saw the firearm that investigators found after McCurley directed them to its location. Then, on the third day, everything changed. McCurley told his attorneys that he wanted to plead guilty. The announcement came suddenly. Carla's family had been prepared to continue listening to testimony, waiting for the jury to deliberate at the end of the case. Instead, they were told that McCurley intended to admit guilt. The courtroom shifted immediately. Carla's brother Jim Walker and sister Cindy Stone were brought back into the courtroom after prosecutors informed them of the change. McCurley signed the necessary paperwork. Judge Elizabeth Beach accepted the guilty plea and sentenced him to life in prison. The trial that had been expected to continue ended that morning. The speed of the conclusion was almost impossible to comprehend when measured against the length of the investigation. 47 years had passed since Carla disappeared, yet the legal resolution took only 3 days of trial proceeding. The contrast was staggering. Decades of uncertainty were followed by a few days of evidence, then a guilty plea, then a life sentence. For Carla's siblings, the moment carried a complicated mixture of relief, grief, anger, and exhaustion. Cindy Stone stood before McCurley and delivered a victim impact statement. She reminded him that she had spent 17 years sharing a bedroom with her sister. She spoke about Carla's small stature and the life that had been taken from her. She told McCurley that he had choices that night and chose to kill. She also challenged him over his continued denials concerning parts of the crime. Her words were not simply about punishment. They were about the unanswered questions that remained even after the guilty plea. The family had finally obtained legal justice, but they still wanted the truth. Jim Walker also spoke. He had been 12 years old on the night Carla was murdered. He remembered the moment his family's ordinary evening became a nightmare. Relatives had been together. His parents were waiting for Carla to come home. Then Rodney McCoy arrived at the door, injured and desperate, telling them that Carla needed help. Jim remembered his father leaving for the bowling alley with a gun. He remembered the confusion and terror of that night. Decades later, he stood only a few feet from McCurley and finally addressed the man responsible. His statement was filled with anger, but it also contained something unexpected: forgiveness. Jim said that over the years he had imagined confronting McCurley, but his faith eventually changed how he viewed the situation. He also expressed compassion for McCurley's family, who had not committed the crime but had lived with the consequences of his actions. The courtroom witnessed an extraordinary scene after the guilty plea. McCurley's son, Roddy, approached Jim Walker. The two men embraced. Roddy cried. Jim held him. The families on opposite sides of a murder case had found themselves connected by the same tragedy, although in completely different ways. Carla's family had lost a sister and daughter. McCurley's family had learned that a husband and father had committed an unforgivable crime. Neither family could undo the past, but the embrace showed that the consequences of violence extend beyond the person who commits it. McCurley's wife, Judy, also spoke about the devastation caused by the crime and expressed sorrow for the Walker family. Her sister Barbara Adams said plainly that their hearts broke for what one member of their family had done to another. It was a remarkable ending to a case that had begun with violence and secrecy. The killer had spent decades hidden in ordinary life. The victim's family had spent decades searching for answers. DNA had finally exposed the connection. Genetic genealogy had narrowed the path. Detectives had followed it. A confession had emerged, and then the defendant had accepted a life sentence. Yet the emotional ending did not erase the questions that remained. Why had the original investigation failed to identify McCurley? Why had his name disappeared from the center of the case after he was questioned? Why had a man who had been linked to the weapon clue in 1974 remained free for 47 years? And could modern forensic science have solved the case earlier if the technology had existed? There was no way to know. The investigators of 1974 had worked with what they had. The detectives of 2019 and 2020 worked with what science had become. The difference was enormous. In the original investigation, a gun owner who denied involvement and passed a polygraph was not enough to build a murder case. In the reopened investigation, biological evidence could establish a connection that no interrogation could erase. That was the power of the new investigation. It did not rely on memory alone. It did not depend on someone suddenly confessing. It did not require a witness to recognize a face nearly 50 years later. It followed the DNA, and the DNA led investigators back to a name that had been present from the beginning. After the guilty plea, Jim Walker said he felt peaceful. Cindy Stone said she felt relief. Those words carried enormous significance because neither described happiness in the ordinary sense. Carla was still dead. Her family still had 47 years of memories without her. The verdict could not change that. But the uncertainty was gone. The question that had haunted them since 1974 had finally been answered. Carla Walker had not disappeared into an unsolved mystery. Her killer had been identified. Her case had been resolved, and the evidence that finally exposed him had been waiting for decades, hidden inside material collected when Carla was still alive. The cold case had not been empty. It had been silent. The difference was everything. The guilty plea ended the courtroom battle, but it did not end the questions surrounding Carla Walker's murder. For the Walker family, the word guilty could never erase February 1974. It could not return the 17-year-old girl who had left for a Valentine's dance and never came home. It could not give her parents back the decades they spent waiting. It could not restore the years Carla should have lived. And it could not change the fact that a man had been able to remain free for nearly half a century while the evidence connecting him to the crime sat quietly inside an old case file. Yet the conviction did something profoundly important. It established that the mystery was finally over in the eyes of the law. Glenn Samuel McCurley had admitted responsibility for Carla's murder and received a life sentence. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved had reached its legal conclusion, but the road to that conclusion revealed something larger about the nature of cold cases. Sometimes the answer is not missing. Sometimes it is trapped inside evidence that investigators simply cannot interpret yet. In Carla's case, that evidence had been collected in 1974, preserved for decades, and eventually transformed by modern DNA technology into the key that opened the entire investigation. To understand why that breakthrough mattered so much, it is necessary to return to the years when the case seemed to be fading into history. After Carla's body was discovered near Benbrook Lake on February 20th, 1974, investigators knew they were dealing with a brutal homicide. They had a victim. They had a surviving witness. They had a weapon connection. They had a physical description. They had a crime scene. They had biological evidence. On paper, the case seemed to contain many of the ingredients investigators needed. But evidence is only useful when it can be connected to a person. The biological material recovered from Carla could not identify an individual in 1974. The weapon evidence could not prove who had used the gun. The witness description was not precise enough to guarantee an identification, and the suspect who drew attention because of the Ruger denied involvement. The investigation therefore entered the long, frustrating territory of the unsolved homicide. Detectives continued working leads, but the case gradually lost momentum. The absence of a suspect meant there was no obvious path forward. No arrest meant no interrogation. No interrogation meant no confession. No database match meant no genetic identification. The case had reached a wall created partly by technology and partly by uncertainty. Carla's family, however, never accepted that the absence of an arrest meant the absence of an answer. Her siblings continued to remember her as she had been before the murder. Jim Walker was 12 when Carla died. Cindy Stone was 17 and had shared a bedroom with her sister. Their memories were not forensic evidence, but they were part of the reason the case remained emotionally alive. Carla was not simply a name in a police report. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, and a teenager whose life had been interrupted before she had the opportunity to become an adult. Her family carried photographs of her through the years. They watched birthdays arrive without her. They watched anniversaries pass. They watched other families celebrate milestones that Carla would never experience, and eventually their parents died without seeing the killer brought to justice. That loss became one of the most painful aspects of the cold case. The people who had known Carla best were slowly disappearing while the mystery remained. The passage of time seemed to favor the killer, but the evidence was waiting. In 2019, the Fort Worth Police Department reopened the case. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett began reviewing the old investigation. Their work reflected a fundamental principle of cold case investigation. Never assume that an old case contains nothing new. The facts may be decades old, but the technology used to examine those facts does not have to be. They went through reports, evidence, witness accounts, and previous investigative theories. They examined material that had been collected when Carla was alive and asked what modern science could now reveal. The answer came from her clothing. Scientists tested biological evidence associated with Carla's bra. Earlier efforts had failed to produce a usable profile, but improved technology allowed investigators to develop a male DNA profile. That profile was powerful because it represented an individual genetic signature. Yet when investigators searched CODIS, there was no match. The killer was still not in the law enforcement database. The investigation could have stalled again. Instead, detectives took another step. They used forensic genetic genealogy. The technique works differently from traditional DNA database searches. Rather than looking for an exact match to a known offender, investigators can compare an unknown profile against genetic information voluntarily uploaded to genealogy databases and search for relatives. The unknown person's identity may then be reconstructed through family relationships. It is painstaking work. A database does not simply announce, "This is the killer." It provides connections. Investigators must build family trees, eliminate unrelated branches, and determine which individual fits the genetic and historical evidence. In Carla's case, that process eventually led investigators toward the McCurley family. 3 brothers appeared as possible relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. One of them was Glenn Samuel McCurley. The significance was immediate. McCurley was not a random name pulled from a database. His name had already appeared in the original investigation. In 1974, police had learned that he owned a .22 Ruger, the same type of weapon connected to the attack on Rodney McCoy. McCurley had claimed the gun was stolen. He had taken a polygraph and passed. The case had never established that his weapon was the weapon used against McCoy and Carl. But now, nearly 50 years later, his family was appearing in a genetic investigation based on DNA recovered from Carla's clothing. It was the kind of connection that would have been unimaginable in 1974. Investigators needed confirmation. They watched McCurley and eventually recovered discarded DNA from outside his home. The laboratory comparison produced the critical result. The DNA matched the profile recovered from Carla's clothing. The genetic genealogy lead had become a direct forensic connection. Investigators then obtained a cheek swab from McCurley, and the direct test confirmed the match. The unknown male contributor was Glenn Samuel McCurley. The suspect from the old case had become the identified suspect in the new case. On September 21st, SIL 2020, he was arrested. He was 77 years old. The arrest itself carried an almost surreal quality. A murder that had happened when McCurley was a young man had finally caught up with him when he was an elderly man. The detectives who arrested him were working in a world where DNA databases and genetic genealogy could reach backward through time. The investigators of 1974 had been working in a world where biological evidence could not provide that kind of identification. The difference between those two worlds was the difference between a cold case and an arrest. But McCurley did not immediately confess. During his first interview, he denied knowing Carla and denied responsibility for her death. He continued to maintain elements of his old explanation about the stolen ruby. Detectives, however, had something that earlier investigators did not have. They could tell him that his DNA had been found on Carla's clothing. The interview continued. His story began to change. Eventually, according to the evidence presented at trial, he admitted killing Carla. The confession was significant, but it was not the foundation of the investigation. The DNA had already identified him. That distinction is crucial. The case was not solved because an elderly suspect suddenly decided to confess after 47 years. It was solved because modern forensic science created a connection that investigators could then confront him with. His statements became another piece of the puzzle. They did not create the puzzle. The DNA did. That is why Carla's case became such a powerful example of the potential of forensic genetic genealogy. The technology did not need the killer to cooperate. It did not need him to volunteer his DNA. It did not need him to admit anything. It began with biological material taken from the victim and moved outward through genetic relationships until investigators found a person whose identity could be tested directly. It turned an unknown profile into a family. The family became a suspect. The suspect became a DNA match. The match became an arrest. And the arrest became a confession and guilty plea. The sequence was almost impossible to imagine when Carla was killed, yet the physical evidence had survived long enough for that sequence to become possible. The trial began in August 2021. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy investigation, the firearm evidence, and McCurley's recorded statements. Rodney McCoy testified about the attack. He described how the gunman assaulted him and took Carla. The prosecution showed the jury how the evidence from the original investigation connected to the evidence discovered decades later. The defense challenged the DNA and the circumstances surrounding McCurley's interview. Questions were raised about the handling of old evidence and whether contamination could have occurred, but the prosecution argued that the evidence had been properly preserved and that the genetic match was genuine. Then came the recorded confession. The jury heard McCurley discuss the murder. They heard him acknowledge responsibility. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. And on the third day of the trial, McCurley pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced him to life in prison. The legal process was complete. Yet for the Walker family, the emotional process had only begun. They had spent decades imagining the moment when the killer would finally be identified. The reality was not dramatic in the way movies often portray such moments. There was no sudden courtroom explosion. There was no triumphant celebration. There was grief. There were tears. There was relief. There was exhaustion. 47 years of uncertainty cannot disappear in a single morning. Carla's siblings had lived most of their lives without her. Their parents had died without answers. The guilty plea could not change those facts, but it could give them something they had never had: finality. Cindy Stone confronted McCurley in court. She spoke about sharing a bedroom with Carla. She spoke about the 17-year-old girl whose life had been stolen. She questioned why he continued to deny parts of the crime. Even after pleading guilty, her words revealed the emotional complexity of the case. A guilty plea answers the legal question, but it does not necessarily answer every personal question. Families often want details. They want to know why. They want to know what happened during the final hours. They want to understand what motivated the killer. They want to know whether their loved one was afraid. They want to know whether there was anything they could have done. Those questions can survive even after a conviction. Jim Walker also addressed McCurley. His statement carried the weight of someone who had been 12 years old when his sister disappeared. He described the impact the murder had on his family. Yet he also spoke about forgiveness. He had imagined confronting the killer for years, but eventually he chose not to allow hatred to control the rest of his life. He even embraced McCurley as son after the sentencing. That moment became one of the most unexpected images from the conclusion of the case. On one side stood a family whose sister and daughter had been murdered. On the other stood a son whose father had been convicted of that murder. The two families had been connected by violence they had not chosen. The embrace did not erase the crime. It did not excuse McCurley. It simply showed how complicated the human consequences of murder can become. Carla's family had waited 47 years for justice. McCurley's family had to confront the reality of what he had done. And at the center of both experiences was a young woman who had never been given the opportunity to grow old. The case, therefore, ended with a strange mixture of resolution and permanent loss. The legal mystery was solved. The emotional wound remained. Carla was still 17. The family still had decades without her. But the killer was no longer unknown. That mattered. It mattered because the Walker family had spent nearly half a century carrying an unanswered question. It mattered because Carla's name would no longer be attached to an unsolved murder. It mattered because the evidence collected from her body had finally done what investigators had hoped it might do: reveal the person responsible. And it mattered because the case demonstrated that time does not necessarily destroy forensic truth. Evidence can outlive theories. It can outlive investigators. It can outlive suspects. It can outlive witnesses. It can remain inside a sealed package waiting for a future technology that has not yet been invented. Carla's DNA evidence waited 47 years. When investigators finally had the tools to interpret it, the past opened. The old name returned. The old gun connection returned. The old mystery returned. But this time, there was a difference. There was proof. The case of Carla Walker had finally crossed the distance between suspicion and accountability, and the woman who had disappeared after a high school dance was no longer a forgotten name in an aging police file. She had become the reason a decades-old investigation was reopened, the reason forensic genealogy was put to the test, and the reason a killer who had remained free for most of his life finally stood before a judge. 47 years had passed, but the evidence had waited, and when it finally spoke, it spoke loudly enough to be heard. For nearly half a century, the name Carla Walker existed in two worlds at once. In one world, she was a 17-year-old girl whose photograph remained frozen in time, forever young, forever remembered by the people who had loved her. In the other, she was a case number inside a police archive surrounded by reports, photographs, evidence envelopes, witness statements, and questions that refused to disappear. The guilty plea of Glenn Samuel McCurley finally pushed those two worlds together. The victim was no longer attached to an unknown killer. The cold case had a name, a confession, and a sentence. But as investigators and family members looked back over the decades, one fact became impossible to ignore. The murder had never truly been forgotten. It had simply been waiting for science to catch up with the evidence. In 1974, investigators had followed the information available to them. They knew Carla had been abducted from a bowling alley parking lot after spending Valentine's evening with Rodney McCoy. They knew McCoy had been attacked with a firearm. They knew Carla had been taken away. They knew her body was discovered days later near Benbrook Lake. They knew a .22 caliber weapon was involved. They knew that a magazine had been recovered after the struggle. They knew McCoy had provided a description of the attacker and a vehicle description. They also knew that Glenn Samuel McCurley had owned a .22 Ruger, but knowledge and proof were two different things. McCurley denied involvement. He said his weapon had been stolen. He passed a polygraph. There was not enough evidence to establish that he had been the killer. The investigation moved forward without him, and that decision would define the case for decades. The murder became one of those haunting cases that investigators could never completely close, but could not solve either. The file remained alive in the sense that detectives could return to it, but years passed without a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Carla's family continued aging without her. Her parents lived with the unbearable knowledge that their daughter had been murdered but did not know who had done it. Her siblings grew into adulthood carrying memories of a girl who would never grow older. Birthdays became anniversaries. Anniversaries became decades. The family watched the world change around them while Carla remained trapped in the same year. The original investigators eventually retired. Some died. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. Yet the physical evidence remained. That evidence would become the bridge between the 20th century and the 21st. By the time Fort Worth detectives reopened the investigation, DNA technology had transformed criminal investigation. Biological material that once might have been described only as blood, semen, or tissue could now contain an individual's genetic profile. But even with that technology, the first step was not enough. Investigators needed to determine whether the old evidence still contained usable DNA. The material associated with Carla's clothing was examined again. Scientists were able to develop a male profile from biological material recovered from her bra. The discovery was extraordinary. A murder committed nearly 50 years earlier had suddenly produced a genetic clue that investigators could potentially compare against modern databases. The profile was submitted for comparison through the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS. There was no direct match. For a moment, it seemed the technology had provided a clue without providing a name, but investigators had learned not to stop there. A DNA profile without a CODIS hit did not mean the evidence was useless. It meant the person was not in the database under the circumstances being searched. The next step was more innovative. Investigators turned toward genetic genealogy. Instead of asking, "Who is this exact person?" they asked, "Who are this person's relatives?" That subtle change transformed the investigation. Genetic genealogy works through relationships. A person may never have submitted DNA to law enforcement, but relatives may have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to genealogy databases for family history research. Those relatives can create pathways toward a person whose identity is unknown. Investigators then build genealogical trees, tracing names, marriages, siblings, descendants, and family branches. It is not a magic button. It is detective work combined with genetics. In Carla's case, that process eventually brought investigators to the McCurley family. 3 brothers emerged as possible relatives of the unknown contributor. One name immediately stood out: Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was not merely another man sharing a surname. He had been connected to the original investigation. Decades earlier, detectives had questioned him because of his point to 2 Ruger. The coincidence was extraordinary. A name from the 1974 investigation had reappeared through a DNA-based genealogical investigation in the 21st century, but detectives knew they needed more. A genetic genealogy lead is not the same as a courtroom identification. Investigators needed a direct comparison between McCurley and the biological evidence. They began watching him. Eventually, they recovered discarded material from outside his residence. The DNA extracted from that material matched the unknown male profile associated with Carla's clothing. The connection was no longer theoretical. It was personal. It was forensic. It pointed directly toward McCurley. Investigators obtained another DNA sample from him to confirm the result. That direct comparison established the match. The biological evidence from Carla was connected to Glenn Samuel McCurley. The man who had once been a suspect in 1974 had become the identified contributor in 2020. On September 21st, SIL 2020, McCurley was arrested. He was 77 years old. His arrest shocked people who had followed the case because the suspect was no longer a young man. He was an elderly man who had lived nearly his entire adult life after Carla's murder. For the Walker family, the news was difficult to absorb. They had spent so many years hearing that the killer had not been found that the sudden appearance of an arrest almost felt unreal. But investigators were not finished. They needed to know what McCurley would say when confronted with the evidence. The interview began with denial. McCurley told detectives that he did not know Carla. He denied being responsible for her murder. He repeated the story surrounding his Ruger. But the detectives had the DNA evidence in front of them. They knew the genealogical trail. They knew the direct comparison. They knew the old reports. They continued questioning him. As the interview progressed, McCurley's account changed. According to prosecutors, he eventually admitted responsibility for Carla's death. The detectives recorded the conversation. It became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. The confession was disturbing because it came after decades of silence. Yet the detectives had not relied solely on the confession. They had already established the biological connection. The confession became confirmation rather than the starting point. The investigation had effectively moved in reverse through time. It began with DNA collected in 1974. It traveled through modern genetic genealogy. It reached McCurley in 2020. Then his statements opened another path back toward the original crime. He eventually told investigators about a firearm hidden inside his home. Investigators searched the location he described and found a .22 Ruger concealed in the attic. The discovery immediately revived one of the earliest clues in the case. In 1974, McCurley had told police that his Ruger had been stolen. Nearly 5 decades later, investigators found a Ruger hidden inside his home after McCurley directed them to the location. The weapon became another piece of the prosecution's evidence. It did not have to solve the case by itself. The DNA already provided a powerful connection, but the firearm created a disturbing echo between the original investigation and the modern one. The object that had once been described as stolen was still connected to McCurley decades later. That historical continuity mattered. It suggested that some of the questions investigators had asked in 1974 had never been irrelevant. They had simply never been answered. The case eventually reached trial in August 2021. McCurley initially pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors prepared to present their evidence to a jury. The courtroom became a place where decades collided. Modern forensic scientists explained DNA. Detectives explained genetic genealogy. Investigators discussed the recovered weapon. Rodney McCoy described the attack that had left him injured and Carla missing. The prosecution presented McCurley's recorded interview. The jury heard his changing explanation. They heard him acknowledge the killing, and the defense challenged the evidence. Attorneys questioned the handling of the biological material over decades. They questioned the possibility of contamination. They challenged the circumstances surrounding McCurley's interview and the statements he made after his arrest. These arguments mattered because the case depended on evidence that had been preserved for an extraordinary length of time. A defense lawyer could point to the decades between the crime and the test. Prosecutors could point to the fact that the evidence had been preserved and that multiple lines of evidence converged on the same suspect. The jury was being asked to evaluate not one clue, but an entire chain. DNA connected McCurley to biological evidence. Genetic genealogy connected the unknown profile to his family. Discarded DNA connected the profile directly to him. A direct sample confirmed the result. The historical firearm connection placed his name in the original investigation. The hidden Ruger added another physical link. His recorded statements provided admission. The total picture was far different from the one available to detectives in 1974. Then came the moment that ended the trial before the jury could reach a verdict. McCurley changed his plea. He admitted guilt to capital murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The Walker family had finally heard the word they had waited nearly 50 years to hear. But the emotional reaction was not simple celebration. It was grief mixed with relief. Carla was still gone. Her family had still lived decades without her. Her parents had died without seeing the man responsible held accountable. No courtroom could repair that. No sentence could return the life that had been stolen. Yet the guilty plea removed the most painful uncertainty. The family no longer had to wonder whether the killer would ever be identified. They knew who he was. They knew he had admitted responsibility. They knew where he would spend the remainder of his life. For Carla's siblings, that knowledge had enormous weight. Jim Walker had been only 12 when his sister was murdered. He had carried the case through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and middle age. When he finally stood before McCurley, he could have chosen anger alone. Instead, he spoke about forgiveness. That decision was deeply personal. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting Carla. It did not mean minimizing the crime. It meant refusing to allow the killer to control the rest of his life. Cindy Stone also spoke, remembering the sister with whom she had shared a bedroom. Her words were filled with pain because the guilty plea could not answer every question. She wanted to know why McCurley had done it. She wanted to know what happened during those final hours. She wanted the truth without the excuses. The courtroom could establish responsibility, But some mysteries remain beyond the reach of evidence. That is one of the cruel realities of cold cases. Solving a murder does not necessarily explain it. Identifying a killer does not restore the victim's final moments. A confession does not automatically reveal every detail, and a conviction does not reverse time. What it can do is give a family something that had been absent for decades: certainty. The Walker family finally knew that the man who had taken Carla was not an anonymous stranger lost forever in the past. He had been identified. He had confessed. He had been sentenced. The case had ended. Yet the story of Carla's murder had another disturbing dimension. Investigators were aware of other unsolved crimes from the region and examined whether McCurley could have been connected to them. Suspicion alone was not enough. No additional charges were brought against him in connection with those cases. That distinction mattered. The justice system could only punish him for crimes supported by evidence. Case had that evidence. Other cases did not necessarily have the same proof. The investigators therefore left those questions where they belonged, in the realm of investigation, not accusation. Carla's case nevertheless became a striking example of what can happen when old evidence is revisited. The killer did not suddenly become careless. He did not leave a new confession in a letter. He did not walk into a police station after 47 years and surrender. The breakthrough came because the evidence had been waiting. Science changed. Investigative methods changed. Genetic genealogy emerged as a tool. And suddenly, material collected when Carla was 17 could identify a man decades later. The case demonstrated the strange relationship between time and evidence. Time can destroy memories. It can erase witnesses. It can change landscapes. But DNA can remain. A biological trace can survive while an entire generation disappears. The investigators who finally solved the case were working with information created in the past but interpreted with technology from the future. That is why Carla Walker's murder remains such a powerful cold case story. It is not simply the story of a murder solved after 47 years. It is the story of evidence refusing to disappear. It is the story of a family refusing to forget. It is the story of a suspect who had once been questioned and then vanished from the center of the investigation, only to reappear decades later through genetic science. And it is the story of a 17-year-old girl whose life ended in 1974, but whose case continued moving through time until investigators finally had the tools to hear what the evidence had been saying all along. Carla never got to grow older. Her family did. The detectives did. The technology did. The world did. But the evidence stayed behind, waiting in silence. And when the silence finally broke, it did not produce a theory. It produced a name. By the time the Walker family heard that Glenn Samuel McCurley had pleaded guilty, the case had already crossed an almost unimaginable distance through time. 47 years separated the night Carla was taken from the moment her killer finally accepted responsibility in court. But the years between those two moments were not empty. They were filled with investigation, disappointment, memories, unanswered questions, and the gradual transformation of a teenage murder into one of Fort Worth's most enduring cold cases. Every new decade seemed to make the possibility of a solution more remote, yet the evidence never stopped existing. The investigators changed. The technology changed. The people involved changed. The evidence remained. And that distinction would eventually become the reason Carla's family heard the word they had waited almost half a century to hear. It began with a normal teenage evening. Carla Walker was 17 years old in February 1974. She was a high school student, a daughter, a sister, and a young woman with a future that had not yet been written. She went to a Valentine's dance with Rodney McCoy. Nothing about that evening suggested that it would become the final night of her life. After the dance, Carla and McCoy went to the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl parking lot. They sat inside McCoy's car. Then an armed man approached. The attack was sudden. McCoy was struck with a pistol and rendered unconscious. Carla was taken from the vehicle. In those seconds, an ordinary night became a kidnapping. McCoy survived the attack, but Carla disappeared. Investigators immediately began searching for her. They had a witness, but that witness had been violently attacked and had only limited information about the perpetrator. He described a white male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall and around 175 pounds, with short brown hair and a brown cowboy hat. He also remembered a light-colored Camaro. Those details were important, but they were not enough to identify the attacker with certainty. The investigation expanded. Detectives collected physical evidence from the parking lot. Among the items recovered was a magazine from a .22 caliber firearm. That detail would later become crucial because investigators learned that Glenn Samuel McCurley owned a .22 Ruger. McCurley became a person of interest. He was questioned. He denied involvement. He claimed his Ruger had been stolen from his truck while he was fishing. He passed a polygraph examination. At the time, investigators did not have enough evidence to prove that McCurley had committed the kidnapping. The case remained open. Then, on February 20th, Carla's body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. The discovery ended the search for a missing girl and began a homicide investigation. The medical evidence revealed that Carla had suffered horrific violence. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Morphine was found in her system. Investigators determined that she had remained alive for approximately 2 days after her abduction. That fact was devastating because it meant that Carla had not died immediately after she was taken. She had been alive somewhere while her family searched for her. Somewhere the killer had kept her. Somewhere the final hours of her life had passed. Investigators collected additional biological evidence and preserved Carla's clothing. But in 1974, DNA could not identify an unknown suspect in the way it can today. The science simply was not there. Investigators could preserve the evidence, but they could not turn it into a modern genetic profile. That limitation would define the next 4 decades. The case did not lack evidence. It lacked a technology capable of translating the evidence into an identity. For Carla's parents and siblings, that distinction meant little. They only knew that their daughter and sister was gone. They wanted the person responsible found. They wanted to know why. They wanted Carla to have justice. The years passed without an arrest. The case became cold. But the family did not forget. Carla's photograph remained. Her voice remained in memories. Her place within the family remained even as time moved forward. Her siblings grew older. Friends moved away. The community changed. Some witnesses died. Investigators retired. Yet the murder continued to exist in the records of the Fort Worth Police Department. Cold cases can become buried beneath newer crimes, but they are rarely erased completely. Files remain, evidence remains, questions remain, and sometimes, decades later, a new investigator opens the file and sees something that an earlier generation could not see. That is what happened when Detective Leo Wagner became involved with Carla's case. Wagner and Detective Jeff Bennett began reviewing the investigation decades after the murder. They approached it with a different set of tools. Their task was not simply to repeat what had already been done. They needed to determine whether the old evidence could now be tested in ways that were impossible in 1974. The investigators returned to Carla's clothing. Modern forensic science had become sensitive enough to recover genetic material from extremely small or degraded samples. Laboratory testing produced a male DNA profile from biological evidence associated with Carla's bra. The profile was the first major breakthrough in decades, but it did not immediately identify anyone. Investigators submitted the DNA profile to CODIS, hoping for a direct match to an offender already in the system. There was no match. That could have been another dead end. Instead, it became the beginning of a completely different type of investigation. Detectives turned toward forensic genetic genealogy. The concept was revolutionary for cold case work. Rather than requiring the killer's DNA to already exist in a criminal database, investigators could search for genetic relatives through genealogy databases. A relative might have submitted DNA for ancestry research. That relative might have no connection to the crime whatsoever, but the shared DNA could reveal a family line. Investigators could then construct genealogical trees and work toward the unknown person. In Carla's case, the genetic search began producing relatives connected to the McCurley family. 3 brothers emerged as possible genetic relatives of the unknown contributor. One of those brothers was Glenn Samuel McCurley. For detectives, the discovery was almost startling. McCurley was not simply a person found through genealogy. He was a person who had already appeared in the original investigation. The same name from 1974 had returned through science nearly 5 decades later. Investigators knew they had to be careful. Genetic genealogy could provide an investigative lead, but they needed direct forensic confirmation before moving forward. They began monitoring McCurley. Eventually, detectives recovered discarded material from outside his home. The laboratory tested the material. The DNA matched the profile developed from Carle's clothing. Investigators then obtained a direct DNA sample from McCurley. That sample confirmed the match. The unknown male contributor was McCurley. The scientific evidence had finally achieved what investigators had been unable to achieve in 1974. It gave the mystery a name. On September 21st, SIL 2020, McCurley was arrested. He was 77 years old. The arrest sent shock waves through the Walker family and the Fort Worth community. A man who had been questioned decades earlier was now accused of the murder. The case that had once seemed frozen was suddenly moving, but the arrest created another question. Would McCurley admit what he had done, or would he continue denying the crime? Investigators interviewed him. At first, he denied knowing Carla. He denied responsibility. He repeated elements of his old explanation about the Ruger. But detectives confronted him with the DNA. They told him that modern science had linked him to biological evidence from Carla. The interview continued for hours. His account changed. Eventually, according to prosecutors, he admitted that he had killed Carla. The confession became a central piece of the prosecution's case. He also told detectives about a .22 Ruger hidden inside his home. Investigators searched the attic and found a firearm where he had indicated. The discovery was deeply significant because of the role the Ruger had played in the original investigation. In 1974, McCurley had claimed that his gun had been stolen. Nearly 5 decades later, a Ruger was found hidden in his home after he directed investigators to it. The case now contained an extraordinary convergence of old and new evidence. The original investigation had identified a firearm connection. Modern science had identified McCurley's DNA. His own statements had provided additional information. The pieces were finally coming together. But prosecutors still had to take the case to court. McCurley was charged with capital murder. The trial began in August 2021. The courtroom became the final stage of a story that had started when Carla was 17. Rodney McCoy testified about the attack. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence. Detectives described the genetic genealogy investigation. The jury heard the recorded interview. They heard McCurley's changing statements. They learned about the firearm discovered in his attic. The defense challenged the evidence, especially the possibility of contamination involving biological material that had been handled over decades. Defense attorneys also questioned the circumstances of McCurley's interview and the reliability of statements made by an elderly suspect during a long interrogation. The prosecution countered with the totality of the evidence. The DNA was not a vague similarity. It was a direct match. The genetic genealogy investigation had led investigators to McCurley. The discarded DNA had confirmed the connection. The direct cheek swab had confirmed it again. The firearm evidence connected back to the original investigation, and McCurley's own statements provided another layer of evidence. The prosecution's case, therefore, did not depend upon a single piece of forensic evidence. It was a chain. Each link supported the next. And the chain had begun with Carle's clothing. That clothing had been collected in 1974, preserved for decades, and eventually tested with technology that could reveal what earlier investigators could not see. The evidence had survived long enough to become readable. During the trial, Carle's family sat through testimony that brought painful memories back to life. They heard descriptions of the attack. They heard details about Carle's final day. They heard the recorded voice of the man accused of killing her. It was not easy. The family had waited decades for answers, but answers can be brutal. A cold case can exist in the imagination. Once solved, the reality becomes concrete. There is a person responsible. There are forensic findings. There are statements. There are details that cannot be unknown again, yet the family continued. They listened. They watched. They waited. Then came the unexpected turn. McCurley changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced him to life in prison. The trial was over. No jury deliberation was necessary. No uncertainty remained about whether McCurley would be convicted. He had admitted guilt. For Carla's siblings, the moment was both devastating and relieving. Jim Walker had spent most of his life wondering whether his sister-S killer would ever be identified. Cindy Stone had carried memories of Carla from childhood into adulthood. Their parents had died without seeing justice. Now, finally, the person responsible was in prison. The guilty plea could not restore Carla, but it gave the family something the cold case had denied them: certainty. Jim later spoke about forgiveness. He acknowledged the pain of what had happened, but refused to allow the killer to control his life forever. He even embraced McCurley as son after the sentencing. The image was striking because the two families had been connected by a crime neither had chosen. Carla's family had lost a beloved daughter and sister. McCurley's family had discovered that someone they knew and loved had committed an unforgivable act. The pain existed on both sides, but it was not equal. The responsibility belonged to McCurley. The families did not share the blame. They shared only the consequences. The case therefore ended with a strange kind of silence. There was no mystery anymore. There was no unidentified suspect. There was no question about whether Carla's killer would ever be named. There was only the reality of what had happened and the years that could never be recovered. Carla was still 17. She would always be 17 in the photographs her family kept. The world around her had changed completely. Technology had changed. Police procedures had changed. DNA science had changed. But Carla's final photograph remained the same. That is perhaps the most painful feature of any decades-old murder. The victim never gets older. Everyone else does. The people who love them age. The detectives age. The suspect ages. The world moves forward. The victim remains exactly where the clock stopped. Carla's clock stopped in February 1974. For 47 years, her family lived with that frozen moment. Then science reopened the door. A DNA profile became a family connection. A family connection became a suspect. A suspect became a match. A match became an arrest. An arrest became a confession. A confession became a guilty plea. And a guilty plea became a life sentence. The chain was complete, but the deeper lesson remained unsettling. The evidence had been there before the technology existed to use it. The killer had not been invisible. He had simply been beyond the reach of the tools available at the time. That distinction gives cold cases their strange power. A case can appear dead for decades while the evidence is still alive. Every preserved biological sample is a message from the past. Every old photograph, every fingerprint, every weapon, every piece of clothing can become meaningful again when technology changes. Carla Walker's case demonstrated that in the most painful possible way, her family had waited almost half a century. They could not bring her back. They could not recover the years she lost. But they could finally say her killer's name. Glenn Samuel McCurley. The name that once appeared in an old police investigation had returned through DNA. And this time, it could not simply disappear. The mystery that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974 had finally been forced into the light. The case had finally reached its legal conclusion, but the deeper story of Carla Walker was not contained inside the courtroom. It lived in the years before the arrest, in the evidence that had survived, and in the terrible realization that the man eventually convicted had once been questioned while the investigation was still young. That fact made the case more haunting, not less. For decades, the Walker family had been forced to live with the possibility that the person responsible was somewhere outside the reach of investigators. They had no name they could trust, no confirmed explanation, no certainty about what had happened after Carla was taken. Then, almost half a century later, modern science brought them back to a name that had already existed in the original case file. Glenn Samuel McCurley had not appeared out of nowhere. His connection to the investigation had existed since 1974. What changed was the evidence available to prove it. In the early hours after Carla disappeared, investigators were working against time. Rodney McCoy had survived the attack, but he had been beaten and was unable to prevent the kidnapping. He could provide investigators with a description, but he had also experienced a traumatic assault. The attacker had used a firearm. During the struggle, a magazine from a .22 caliber weapon was left behind. That object became one of the earliest physical clues. detectives began trying to determine where the weapon might have come from. McCurley entered the investigation because he owned a .22 Ruger. Police questioned him. He denied involvement. He said the weapon had been stolen. He passed a polygraph. There was no forensic method capable of taking DNA from Carle's clothing and identifying him. There was no genealogy database waiting to reveal distant relatives. There was no massive digital system linking biological evidence from old crimes to modern identities. The case therefore depended on traditional investigative methods. Those methods could produce leads, but leads were not enough. Carla's body was found 3 days after her abduction. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family. The search had become a murder investigation. The medical examination provided investigators with evidence about what Carla had endured. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Morphine was present in her system. Investigators determined she had remained alive for a significant period after the abduction. The family now had to confront an unimaginable reality. Carla had not simply vanished and died instantly. She had been held somewhere. Her final hours had unfolded away from the people desperately searching for her. That uncertainty became part of the family as lifelong burden. They did not know where she had been. They did not know what the killer had been thinking. They did not know whether she had tried to escape. They did not know whether she had believed help was coming. They knew only that she had left a Valentine's dance and never returned. The investigation continued, but without an arrest, the case slowly moved into the category of unsolved murders. Detectives changed. Generations changed. Fort Worth changed. The bowling alley and surrounding landscape changed. But the crime remained. A cold case is sometimes described as dormant, but that word can be misleading. Dormant suggests nothing is happening. In reality, the evidence is simply waiting. Carla's case was waiting for a scientific revolution. DNA profiling had not yet entered the criminal justice system when she was killed. Years later, it would transform homicide investigations. But even the first generation of DNA testing was not always enough to solve old cases. Biological samples could degrade. Earlier testing could consume material. Evidence could be stored under conditions that were not designed for decades of preservation. And databases did not contain every offender. Investigators therefore had to wait for technology to become sophisticated enough to extract a usable profile from evidence associated with Carla. When detectives reopened the case decades later, that opportunity finally arrived. The biological evidence associated with Carla's bra produced a male DNA profile. Suddenly, the case contained something that investigators in 1974 could only have dreamed of: a genetic signature belonging to a person connected to the crime. But the first search produced no direct database match. The profile was still anonymous. The killer remained unnamed. Yet investigators had another tool. Forensic genetic genealogy had emerged as a powerful technique in the investigation of old crimes. Instead of searching only for an exact match, investigators could search for genetic relative. The method required patience and careful analysis. A genetic relative could be a cousin, a distant relation, or someone who had never heard of the murder. Investigators could use that connection to build family trees and narrow possibilities. The process eventually led to the McCurley family. The appearance of the surname was a critical moment. It was not merely a genealogical curiosity, it was connected to the original police investigation. Glenn McCurley had owned the type of firearm linked to the 1974 attack. His name had been recorded decades earlier. Now his family was appearing in a modern genetic investigation based on DNA recovered from Carla's clothing. The detectives understood that they could not leap from genealogy to arrest. They needed direct evidence. They began watching McCurley. They recovered discarded material from outside his residence. The DNA from that material matched the unknown profile. Then investigators obtained a direct sample from McCurley and confirmed the result. The mystery had finally become a person. On September 21st, SIL 2020, police arrested McCurley at his home. He was 77 years old. The arrest was a collision between two eras. The crime belonged to the 1970s. The arrest belonged to the age of genetic genealogy. The same man who had once been questioned as a young suspect was now being taken into custody as an elderly defendant. For the Walker family, the news was overwhelming. They had waited so long that some members of the family had stopped expecting an arrest. Their parents had died. Their childhood memories of Carla had become adult memories. The people who once promised that the killer would be found were gone. Yet suddenly, the promise had been fulfilled. The detectives now had to confront McCurley directly. The interview began with denial. He did not immediately accept responsibility. He denied knowing Carla. He denied killing her. But the investigators had the DNA evidence. They knew that the biological material from Carla's clothing matched him. They knew that the genetic genealogy had pointed toward his family. They knew that a direct comparison had confirmed the match. They also knew about the old Ruger connection. As the interview continued, McCurley's story changed. Eventually, he admitted responsibility for Carla's death. He provided investigators with information about a .22 Ruger hidden in his attic. Police searched the location and found the firearm. That discovery created an eerie connection to the original investigation. The weapon had been part of the story since 1974. McCurley had once claimed his Ruger had been stolen. Decades later, a Ruger was found hidden inside his home. The prosecution did not need to depend entirely on proving that this was the exact firearm used in the murder. The significance came from the totality of the circumstances. The DNA was the primary modern breakthrough. The weapon was a historical connection. The statements were an additional link. Together, they formed a case that had been impossible to build in 1974. When McCurley went to trial in 2021, the courtroom became a place where the past was reconstructed through modern evidence. Rodney McCoy testified about the attack. His testimony carried enormous emotional weight because he was the only person known to have survived the initial encounter with the attacker. He had lived with the memory for decades. He had been the person who came to the Walker home, injured, and told Carla's family that she had been taken. His testimony allowed the jury to hear what the beginning of the crime looked like. The prosecution then introduced the DNA evidence. Scientists and investigators explained how the profile had been developed from biological material associated with Carla. They explained the genealogy process and the eventual identification of McCurley. The defense challenged the evidence. Could biological material have been contaminated over 47 years? Could someone else's DNA have been transferred onto Carla's clothing? Could the testing have produced an incorrect result? These were legitimate questions for the jury to consider, but the prosecution emphasized that the evidence had not appeared in isolation. The DNA matched McCurley. The genetic genealogy led to him. The direct sample confirmed him. His statements connected him to the murder, and his knowledge about the hidden firearm provided another piece of corroborating information. Then the jury heard McCurley's recorded interview. The man who had denied involvement at first was now heard discussing the murder with detectives. The passage of time was audible in his voice. He was an elderly man discussing a crime from when he was young. For the Walker family, hearing those words must have been deeply painful. For the investigators, they represented the moment when the cold case became an admission. But the trial did not last long. After 2 days of testimony, McCurley changed his plea. He admitted guilt. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The family had finally reached the moment they had imagined for decades. Yet the sentencing did not create the kind of triumphant ending often portrayed in crime stories. There was no way for the family to celebrate the fact that Carla had been murdered. There was only relief that the person responsible would finally face consequences. Carla's siblings addressed the court. Cindy Stone spoke about the sister she had known when they were young. She remembered sharing a bedroom with Carla. She described the devastating impact of losing her. Her statement made clear that the crime had not ended when Carla's body was found. It had continued through every year her family lived without her. Jim Walker had been 12 years old when the murder happened. By the time McCurley was sentenced, he was an adult who had carried the memory for nearly his entire life. He spoke about the pain, the anger, and the desire for justice, but he also spoke about forgiveness. His choice surprised people because forgiveness can appear impossible in a case involving such violence, yet Jim explained that forgiveness was something he needed for himself. He did not want to spend the rest of his life consumed by hatred for the man who had already taken so much from his family. After the sentencing, Jim embraced McCurley as son. It was an unexpected moment in a courtroom filled with decades of pain. The son had not committed the crime. He was dealing with the terrible knowledge that his father had been responsible for an act that destroyed another family. The embrace did not erase the crime. It did not lessen Carla's suffering. It simply separated the actions of one man from the lives of the people around him. That distinction was important. McCurley alone was responsible for the murder. His family had inherited the consequences, but not the guilt. The resolution of the case also raised broader questions about unsolved murder. How many old cases contain evidence that has never been tested with modern methods? How many victims remain unidentified? How many families continue waiting because the technology needed to solve their cases has not yet been applied? Carla's case demonstrated that reopening an old investigation can produce results even when decades have passed, but it also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. Without the biological material from Carla's clothing, there might never have been a genetic breakthrough. Without investigators willing to reopen the file, the evidence might have remained untouched. Without genetic genealogy, the DNA might have remained anonymous. Without traditional detective work, the genealogical lead might never have become an arrest. Every stage depended on the previous one. The case was solved through a combination of old evidence and new science. That combination is what made the story so extraordinary. The killer was not exposed because the past suddenly became clearer on its own. He was exposed because investigators learned how to read the past differently. A biological trace that once had no name suddenly became a genetic profile. The profile became a family connection. The family connection became a suspect. The suspect became a DNA match. The DNA match became an arrest. The arrest became a confession. The confession became a guilty plea. And the guilty plea finally gave Carla's family an answer. But there was one thing the investigation could never recover: time. Carla should have grown up. She should have finished school. She should have experienced adulthood. She should have watched her siblings grow older. She should have had decades of ordinary moments that the rest of her family took for granted. Instead, her life remained fixed at 17. That is the cruelest mathematics of a cold case. The killer ages, the detectives age, the family ages. The victim does not. Carla remained 17 while 47 years passed around her. Her photograph never changed. Her family did. Her hometown did. The technology used to investigate her death did. But the girl at the center of the case remained exactly where she had been left on that February night. The resolution could not change that. It could only give her story an ending that the investigation had been unable to provide for generations. For nearly 5 decades, Carla Walker was a victim without a convicted killer. Now she had a name attached to the crime, and that name would remain in the record not as an unanswered possibility, but as the man who pleaded guilty and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The mystery had finally been solved, but the silence surrounding Carla had changed forever. It was no longer the silence of an unsolved case. It was the silence that comes after an answer. For Carla Walker's family, the guilty plea brought an ending to the legal mystery, but it also opened a different kind of silence, one that comes after decades of questions finally receive answers. For 47 years, the family had lived with uncertainty. They knew Carla had been kidnapped. They knew she had been murdered. They knew someone had taken her from a parking lot and left her body near Benbrook Lake. But they did not know the identity of the person responsible. They could not point to a face. They could not hear a confession. They could not watch a courtroom sentence the man who had taken their daughter and sister. That changed in 2021. Glenn Samuel McCurley pleaded guilty to capital murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Yet the emotional consequences of that moment were far more complicated than the legal record could ever show. A conviction can establish responsibility, but it cannot reconstruct a stolen life. Carla remained 17. Her family remained older. The decades between those two facts could never be recovered. The story of Carla's murder, therefore, became a story about time itself and about what happens when justice arrives long after the people who first demanded it have disappeared. In 1974, Carla was still living inside a world that seemed ordinary. She attended school. She spent time with friends. She went to a Valentine's dance. She had a boyfriend. She had a family waiting for her to come home. Her parents expected the evening to end like countless other teenage nights. Nobody imagined that a few hours later, the family would be plunged into a nightmare that would last almost half a century. The attack on Rodney McCoy changed everything. McCoy was beaten and knocked unconscious. Carla was taken. When McCoy recovered, he had to face Carla's family and tell them what had happened. Imagine the terror of that moment. A 12-year-old brother, Jim Walker, was suddenly living inside a family crisis he could not understand. His sister was missing. His parents were desperate. Police were arriving. Questions were being asked, and nobody knew whether Carla was alive. The search continued until February 20th, when her body was found. The uncertainty ended, but the grief became permanent. Investigators now knew they were dealing with a homicide. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They pursued leads. One of those leads involved McCurley. His ownership of a .22 Ruger placed him within the investigation, yet the evidence available at that time was insufficient. He denied involvement. He claimed the gun had been stolen. He passed a polygraph. Without modern DNA testing, investigators could not establish the connection that would later become decisive. The case eventually became cold. That phrase sounds clinical, but for a victimless family, it is anything but clinical. A cold case means the world has moved on while the family has not. New crimes demand attention. New victims need investigators. Detectives retire. Evidence is stored. Reports gather dust. But the family still wakes up every morning knowing that someone killed their loved one and was never held accountable. That was the reality for the Walker. They did not have the luxury of forgetting. Carla's birthday remained. The anniversary of her death remained. The photograph remained. Her absence remained. And the possibility that her killer was still alive remained. For years, there was no indication that the case would change. Then technology began changing the rules. DNA profiling had become a standard forensic tool, but old cases presented special challenges. Biological evidence collected decades earlier could be degraded, incomplete, or difficult to test. The question was whether anything useful remained. In Carla's case, modern laboratory methods were able to extract a male DNA profile from biological material associated with her bra. That discovery transformed the investigation. Suddenly, detectives were no longer searching blindly. They had a genetic signature. The problem was that the signature did not produce an immediate CODIS match. The unknown person was not already identified through the law enforcement database. That could have been the end of the breakthrough. Instead, investigators turned toward genetic genealogy. The method had become one of the most important tools for solving certain cold cases. Rather than waiting for the suspect to appear in a criminal database, investigators could search for relatives through genealogy databases. Those relatives might have submitted DNA for entirely innocent reasons. They might have been interested in discovering their ancestry or connecting with distant family members. They might never have known that their genetic information could help solve a decades-old murder. But DNA carries family relationships. A distant relative can become the thread that leads investigators toward an unknown person. In Carla's case, that thread eventually led to the McCurley family. 3 brothers appeared as possible relatives. One was Glenn Samuel McCurley. For investigators, the discovery was astonishing because his name was not new. He had already been investigated in connection with the original crime. Decades earlier, detectives had questioned him about the Ruger. Now, genetic genealogy was independently pointing toward his family. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. But investigators still needed direct evidence. They could not arrest a person simply because his family appeared in a genealogy search. They had to establish that he himself was the source of the DNA. Detectives watched McCurley and recovered discarded material from outside his home. The DNA from that material matched the profile associated with Carla's clothing. A direct cheek swab confirmed the result. The unknown contributor was McCurley. After decades of uncertainty, the biological evidence had finally produced an identity. The arrest followed on September 21st, SIL 2020. The man taken into custody was 77 years old. That detail alone illustrated how much time had passed. The murder had occurred when McCurley was a young man. Now he was an elderly defendant facing the consequences of a crime from the distant past. But age could not erase the evidence. The detectives interviewed him after the arrest. Initially, he denied knowing Carla and denied responsibility. But the interview continued. Investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence. They questioned his account of the night. They pressed him about the weapon. Eventually, his story changed. According to prosecutors, McCurley admitted killing Carla. He also provided information about a .22 Ruger hidden in his attic. Investigators searched the location and recovered the firearm. Once again, the past and present collided. The weapon connection from 1974 had returned in a completely different context. The investigation had started with a stolen Ruger story. Decades later, detectives had found a Ruger hidden in McCurley's home after he directed them to it. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to separate into unrelated coincidences. There was the DNA. There was the genealogy. There was the discarded material. There was the direct confirmation. There were McCurley's statements. There was the firearm. There was the original investigation. The case had finally become a complete chain. When the trial began in August 2021, prosecutors did not have to depend on a single dramatic piece of evidence. They could show the jury how the investigation had evolved. Rodney McCoy testified about the night Carla was taken. His testimony connected the courtroom directly to the original crime. He described the attack and the kidnapping. He told the court about the attacker and the moments before Carla disappeared. The prosecution then introduced the forensic evidence. Detectives explained how modern DNA testing produced the profile. They explained the genetic genealogy process. They explained how the investigation moved toward McCurley. The defense questioned the evidence and challenged the possibility of contamination. After decades of storage and handling, could biological material have been compromised? Could DNA from another person have been transferred? Could the scientific conclusions be wrong? Those questions were part of the defense strategy, but the prosecution emphasized the multiple layers of confirmation. The DNA profile from Carla's clothing matched McCurley. The genealogy investigation pointed toward his family. The discarded material from outside his home matched the same profile. The direct sample confirmed the result. His recorded statements provided additional evidence. The firearm provided another historical connection. The evidence was not one thread. It was a network. The jury was asked to see how each strand led to the same person. Then came McCurley's recorded interview. The courtroom heard his voice. He had initially denied involvement. Later, he acknowledged responsibility. The recording gave jurors something the original investigators had never had: the accused man speaking about the crime nearly half a century later. But before the jury could reach a verdict, McCurley changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced him to life in prison. The Walker family had waited almost 5 decades for this moment, and suddenly it was over. There would be no lengthy deliberation, no suspense over a jury verdict. The defendant had admitted guilt. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the family's grief